In every human culture, at the edges of stories, in whispered prayers, and in images carved into stone, there has always been a figure waiting just beyond the light of the fire. It is not a hero, nor a villain, nor even a god in the ordinary sense. It is the witness to all things, the one who does not fight battles or build cities, yet is present at the end of every kingdom and every life. In the Western imagination, this figure has taken on a form so familiar it almost feels inevitable. A hooded skeleton draped in black, wielding a great scythe, an hourglass in its hand. This is the Grim Reaper. It is one of the most recognizable images in all of human culture, but it is also one of the least understood. For the Reaper is not simply a monster invented to frighten children. It is a mask placed over something much older, an archetype that reaches back thousands of years before the black cloak and the skeletal face became its costume. To understand the Reaper is to confront the oldest and most persistent human attempt to describe death itself. If you imagine yourself walking through a medieval village in Europe during the 14th century, the time when the Black Death swept across the continent, you would see bodies being carried through the narrow streets, carts filled with the dead, and priests reciting last rites over mass graves. Death was not an abstract concept. It was a constant neighbor.
Children died before their names were learned. Women died in childbirth. Men were taken by war or famine. The figure of the Grim Reaper emerged in this world of relentless mortality, a figure that gave a face to the unavoidable truth everyone lived with. But while the plague years solidified the Reaper's most recognizable form, the story does not begin there. The roots of this dark figure stretch much deeper into the soil of human history. Before the skeletal figure with the scythe, there were older visions of death, softer in some cases, harsher in others. The ancient Greeks imagined Thanatos, not a cloaked figure, but a winged spirit, the twin brother of sleep. He was gentle in Homer's descriptions, a presence that closed the eyes of the dead and led them away without cruelty. His Roman counterpart, Mors, was equally inevitable but rarely cruel. For the Greeks and Romans, death was part of a cosmic order, not a separate enemy, but a natural necessity. Yet even here we see the beginnings of personification, the need to describe death not as an event, but as someone, a figure that could be met, spoken to, perhaps even bargained with. Move further north, and the images darken. The Norse knew Hel, the goddess of the underworld, half beautiful and half rotting corpse, ruler of the silent land where most souls went after death. She was not the Reaper, but she embodied the same concept, the personification of death's inevitability and the cold authority of the afterlife. The Celts envisioned the Morrigan, the crow goddess who hovered over battlefields, choosing who would live and who would die, a harbinger of fate in the form of a carrion bird. In Egypt, Anubis guided souls with the head of a jackal, weighing hearts against the feather of truth. None of these beings carried scythes or wore cloaks, yet all were faces of the same ancient impulse. Death is not just something that happens. Death is someone. What would later become the Grim Reaper was formed not in temples or mythic poetry, but in the devastation of the Middle Ages. The scythe, for example, was not chosen at random. It was the most obvious symbol of harvest, the tool that reaped wheat from the fields. In a world where most people were farmers, the metaphor was immediate. Just as the farmer reaped the crop at the appointed season, so too did death reap human lives when their time was done. The skeletal form was equally pragmatic. In an age of plague, when corpses lined the streets and flesh decayed in the open air, the sight of bones was the sight of death itself. Artists painting murals on church walls did not need to invent this imagery. They only needed to reflect what everyone could see with their own eyes. The hood and cloak were added later, drawn from the robes of monks who presided at funerals, their dark garments becoming associated with the solemn passage from life to death. Piece by piece, the figure we now call the Grim Reaper was assembled from the tools, the visions, and the terrors of an entire age. Yet the Reaper is not simply a medieval invention. Its appearance in that period was the crystallization of something humanity had been imagining since the beginning. The universality of the figure across cultures suggests it is more than just folklore. It is what psychologists might call an archetype, an image that arises again and again from the depths of the collective human mind because it represents something so central to our experience that no culture can ignore it. Death cannot be truly understood. It has no voice of its own. So, we give it one. We draw it, dress it, put tools in its hands, and in doing so, we create a mask that lets us approach the unapproachable. If you stood at the edge of a battlefield in the 13th century, surrounded by fallen knights and the cries of the wounded, it would not be difficult to imagine the Reaper walking among them, harvesting lives like wheat. But the same was true for the hunter-gatherer at the edge of the fire 10,000 years before, watching the embers fade, and knowing that one day he too would join the ancestors. He might not have seen a cloaked skeleton, but he would have felt a presence, something watching from the darkness beyond the flames. In that sense, the Grim Reaper is only the latest costume for something as old as human consciousness itself. The power of the figure lies in its paradox. It is terrifying, but also necessary. It is the enemy that defeats everyone, but it is also the servant of time, impartial, harvesting kings and peasants alike. Death is the one force before which all human hierarchies collapse. The Black Death did not spare nobles, and the Grim Reaper does not favor the poor or the powerful. In this sense, the Reaper is a figure of equality, the ultimate leveler. In the famous medieval art of the Dance of Death, skeletons are shown leading men and women of every station, monarchs, bishops, merchants, peasants, in a procession that ends in the grave. No one escapes, and the skeleton is there to remind us that death's hand will take us all in turn. For the people of the Middle Ages, this was not just art or theology, it was survival. To personify death was to make it understandable, to tame its incomprehensible cruelty with a face and a form. If death could be imagined as a figure with a task, then it was not chaos. It was order, a grim but necessary harvest. The scythe that once terrified could also be seen as a promise that there was meaning to the end, that death was not random but part of a cycle. For the Christian, this cycle pointed toward resurrection. For the pagan, it pointed toward the fertility of the earth, nourished by those who returned to the soil. In either case, the Reaper was both terrible and necessary, feared but also strangely reassuring. And so the figure settled into the cultural imagination, appearing in woodcuts, sermons, and folk tales. The black hood, the empty sockets, the curved blade, all became symbols so familiar that even today they need no explanation. The Reaper is not like other monsters. Vampires or werewolves require stories to make sense. The Reaper needs no introduction. Show a child a picture of the hooded skeleton with a scythe, and they will know instinctively what it means. The figure does not frighten because of superstition or ignorance. It frightens because it is true, but the truth is never singular. As the centuries moved on, the Grim Reaper began to shift, to absorb new meanings, to reflect not just fear of dying, but questions about what comes after. The cloak became darker, the scythe sharper, the hourglass more prominent. Time itself was no longer infinite. Every grain of sand that fell was a reminder that our lives are finite, measurable, fragile. The Reaper was no longer just the harvester. He was also the keeper of time, the reminder that we are always walking toward the end. And this is where the story must continue, because to stop here would be to mistake the medieval mask for the original face. The Grim Reaper is not the beginning of the story of death, but only one chapter in a much older narrative. To understand its origins, we must look back, far past the cloistered halls of medieval Europe, past the pestilence and famine to the earliest myths of humanity.
Only then can we begin to unmask the oldest face of death.
The image of the Grim Reaper is made from details so simple that they almost appear inevitable, and yet each of them carries layers of meaning built up across centuries. The most recognizable is the scythe. It seems such a natural pairing that it is difficult to imagine death without it. But in truth, it is a relatively recent addition compared to the deeper mythic associations of death's older faces. A scythe is not a sword or an axe. It is not a weapon of battle or conquest. It is a tool of harvest. It was found in the hands of peasants, not kings, in the fields rather than in palaces. To place it in the hands of death was to draw a deliberate comparison. Humanity itself was the crop, and death was the harvester. In the agricultural societies of Europe, the harvest was the most profound cycle of the year. It was life and death measured in wheat and barley, in rye and oats. A good harvest meant survival through the winter. A bad one meant hunger, sickness, and the silent spread of famine. The cutting of the crop was not only an agricultural act, but a deeply spiritual one. Pagan festivals marked the reaping of the grain with rituals that acknowledged the sacrifice of the earth, the death of the stalks, so that human life might continue. In this world, where every family lived or died by the yield of the fields, the scythe was never a neutral object. It was both salvation and destruction, the curved blade that decided whether there would be bread on the table or empty bowls through the cold months. When plague and famine devastated Europe in the 14th century, the scythe became more than a farmer's tool. It became the perfect metaphor for the sudden, sweeping nature of death itself. The Black Death did not strike with precision. It swept through whole towns, cutting down thousands in the space of weeks. Its work resembled nothing so much as the swinging of a great blade, cutting lives as easily as stalks of wheat. The artists who sought to give form to this devastation did not need to imagine new weapons. They simply looked to the fields outside their walls, where the farmer's curved blade reaped indiscriminately and gave it to death. But the scythe was more than metaphor. In Christian sermons of the time, the harvest had already long been a symbol for divine judgment. The Gospel of Matthew described the end of days as a great harvest, where the wheat would be gathered into barns and the chaff burned with fire. The book of Revelation presented the Son of Man with a sharp sickle in his hand, reaping the earth at the command of an angel. These images would have been familiar to every villager and peasant who heard them from the pulpit, and when famine and plague swept their families away, the sight of death with a scythe was not just a secular metaphor. It was a religious confirmation that the end of life itself was a kind of harvest, ordained and inevitable. The choice of the scythe, then, brought together every aspect of medieval existence: the daily dependence on agriculture, the devastating reality of sudden death, and the biblical imagery of judgment. It was not a sword raised in malice. It was a blade swung in duty. The Reaper was not killing because he chose to, but because it was his task, the task written into the very order of the world. A terrifying thought, but also one that made sense of chaos. Death did not come as a murderer. Death came as the harvester of souls. If the scythe defined the role of the Reaper, the hourglass defined the limits of humanity itself. The hourglass is a strange instrument to place in the hands of death, because it is not an agricultural tool, nor a weapon, nor even a symbol drawn from ancient myth. It is, at its core, a simple device for measuring time. But time is the true substance that death rules over. The scythe may symbolize the act of reaping, but the hourglass is the reason it must happen at all. Before mechanical clocks became widespread, the passage of time was measured in simple, tangible ways. Sundials gave hours in daylight. Water clocks dripped away the minutes in darkness. The hourglass, using the slow and steady fall of sand, offered one of the clearest images of time's irreversibility. Once the sand had passed through, it could not be turned back. It was a physical reminder that time was not endless. For a medieval audience, this was not just a tool for counting hours, but a symbol of mortality. Every grain of sand was a life sliding toward its inevitable end. Placed in the hands of the Grim Reaper, the hourglass told a truth too stark to ignore. Every life is measured. Every heart beats only for the duration of its own sand. No matter how powerful, wealthy, or pious, no one could escape when the last grain fell. To hold an hourglass was to hold the fate of all humanity in a single object. Its symmetry was part of its horror, one bulb full, the other empty, and the unceasing flow between them. There was no pause, no mercy, no way to reverse what had already been lost. Artists of the late Middle Ages and Renaissance often paired the hourglass with skulls, bones, and the motto Memento Mori, remember that you must die. In paintings, the Reaper was sometimes shown with one hand on the scythe and the other lifting an hourglass toward his victim. The message was unmistakable. It was not cruelty or malice that determined the end, it was time. When the sands ran out, the blade would fall. The pairing of scythe and hourglass created a figure that was more than terrifying. It was a complete philosophy. The scythe explained how death worked. It harvested, it cut, it reaped without preference. The hourglass explained why, because time itself was finite, parceled out in a measure no one could control. Together, they formed a closed system, a vision of human life as a crop sown, grown, ripened, and finally cut down at the moment its time expired. And yet, like the cloak and the bones, these symbols did more than terrify. They offered a way to think about the incomprehensible. In a world where plague killed without reason, the scythe suggested order, a harvest, not a slaughter. In a world where life could end without warning, the hourglass suggested justice. Each person's time was measured, and when it ran out, it ran out. There was a strange kind of comfort in imagining death not as chaos, but as inevitability. Over time, the hourglass gained even more resonance. In literature, it became a symbol of urgency, the reminder that love, ambition, and pleasure must all be pursued while sand remains. In theology, it became a reminder of judgment, that the sands of human history itself would one day run dry. In art, it became a companion to the skull, a warning that even the most beautiful faces would one day decay into bone. And through it all, it remained in the hand of the Grim Reaper, not just as a tool, but as a promise. Time runs out for everyone. When we think of the Grim Reaper today, the scythe and the hourglass remain inseparable. Even when artists omit one or the other, the association lingers. The scythe without the hourglass feels incomplete, for without time there is no harvest. The hourglass without the scythe feels empty, for without the blade there is no conclusion. Together they form the most enduring vision of death ever created in human culture. But the story does not end with tools and symbols. Behind the scythe and the hourglass lies an even older history. Death was given weapons and instruments in the Middle Ages, but before that it was given faces, voices, and names. To fully unmask the oldest face of death, we must step further back into the myths and religions of the ancient world, where death first walked the earth not as a skeleton, but as a god. Long before the hooded skeleton with the scythe haunted church walls and folk tales, humanity had already been meeting death in other guises. The idea of personifying death did not begin in medieval Europe. It was older than written language, older than temples, as ancient as the first time a group of hunter-gatherers laid a body to rest in the earth and tried to imagine where the spirit had gone. The first gods of death were not simply destroyers. They were guides, judges, guardians, and rulers of unseen realms. To trace the Grim Reaper's ancestry is to wander through the myths of Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, India, and every place where humans confronted the same unanswerable question: what happens when we die? In the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia, where the first cities rose along the Tigris and Euphrates, death was not imagined as a cloaked figure. It was a realm, dark and dusty, ruled by a queen. Ereshkigal was her name, the sister of the sky goddess Inanna. She ruled the underworld known as Irkala, a place where all souls, regardless of their deeds, descended after death. The Mesopotamians did not imagine a paradise for the good or a torment for the wicked. They saw instead a land of shadows where the dead ate dust and drank from muddy rivers, forever cut off from the pleasures of life. Ereshkigal was not a reaper, but a sovereign, a ruler who received all souls without exception. She was stern, inevitable, and unyielding. To die was to be gathered into her realm.
The myths told of her power in stark terms. When the goddess Inanna dared to visit her, she was stripped naked and forced to hang lifeless on hooks until she was resurrected by intervention from above. Even a goddess of love and fertility could not escape the authority of Ereshkigal. This was one of the earliest attempts to imagine death not as an event, but as a personified power, one with a throne, a domain, and laws that not even gods could break. Though Ereshkigal did not carry a scythe, she was a forerunner of the figure who would, the reminder that death has a face, a name, and an inescapable dominion. Move westward to Egypt, and the images shift, but the idea remains. Death, there was not a ruler, but a guide, embodied in Anubis, the jackal-headed god who presided over embalming and the passage of souls. Anubis was not feared in the same way as Ereshkigal. His presence was ritualized, painted on tomb walls, carved into statues, invoked in prayers. He was the one who received the dead, who wrapped them in linen, who led them to the hall of judgment. In that hall stood another figure, Osiris, the lord of the underworld, who weighed each soul's heart against the feather of Mayat, the principle of truth and cosmic order. If the heart was light, the soul entered eternal life. If it was heavy, it was devoured by the monstrous Amit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus. Here death was not only inevitable, but also moral. It was not simply a harvest, it was a trial.
Anubis, with his long snout and black fur, was the first psychopomp, the guide of souls, while Osiris was the judge. Together, they formed an image of death as something both fearful and hopeful, terrible in its punishment, but offering the possibility of continuation. The Grim Reaper of later centuries would inherit pieces of this, for the hooded skeleton is not only the ender, but also the one who leads us from one state of being to another. Anubis did not reap, but he did escort, and in his long shadow, the Reaper can already be glimpsed. Further east, in the hymns of the Rig Veda, the earliest scriptures of India, another face of death appears, Yama. He was described as the first mortal to die, the first human to journey into the unknown land beyond, and because of this, he became the ruler of the realm of the dead. Yama was not monstrous. He was depicted as a king seated on a throne, flanked by hounds who guarded the path of souls. His role was not to destroy, but to preside, to ensure that the endless procession of the dead found its place in the cosmic order. For the ancient Vedic people, Yama was not only a god of death, but also an ancestor, the one who had gone before and opened the path. Yama's character reveals something essential about humanity's relationship with death. He was not feared like a predator. He was respected as the inevitable authority. His throne was not a gallows, but a court, and his presence was less of a terror than a solemn truth. The Grim Reaper, as we know him, may carry a scythe, but in Yama we see the earlier idea, death as the first traveller, the one who goes before us and waits at the end of the path. Among the Greeks, the vision becomes more varied. Death was not one god, but many figures. Hades ruled the underworld, stern but not cruel, receiving all the souls into his shadowed kingdom. Thanatos personified death itself, a minor deity, but a powerful image. He was described as winged, gentle, sometimes even beautiful, carrying the soul away as softly as a nurse carries a child. His sisters, the carers, were darker, winged spirits who drank blood on battlefields, vicious and merciless. Here, within a single culture, we see the duality that would persist through history, death as both gentle release and violent predator. The Romans absorbed these ideas, renaming Thanatos as mors and continuing to depict death as a figure rather than an abstraction. Their funerary art often showed winged spirits carrying torches turned upside down, symbolizing extinguished life. The Grim Reaper's cloak and scythe were not yet present, but the basic need was the same: to give form to the formless, to make death visible and therefore manageable in the human mind. To the north, among the Norse, death was again given to a woman. Hel, the daughter of Loki, ruled the underworld that bore her name. She was depicted as half-beautiful maiden, half-decayed corpse, her body split between life and death. To enter her hall was not to face torture, but to join the mass of humanity who had died of sickness or old age, rather than gloriously in battle. The warriors who fell with swords in hand went to Odin's hall, Valhalla, but everyone else went to Hel. Her name itself became the root of the word hell, though in its original sense it was not a place of fire, but of cold inevitability. Hel is one of the clearest predecessors to the Grim Reaper, for she embodied the dual nature of death, half living, half dead, terrifying but not wholly evil, ruler of a domain that none could escape. When you place these figures side by side, Ereshkigal in Mesopotamia, Anubis and Osiris in Egypt, Yama in India, Thanatos and Hades in Greece, Hel in the north, you see the same pattern repeated in different costumes. Death is not left vague. Death is imagined as a being with agency, authority, a role to play in the cosmic story. Sometimes this being is a king, sometimes a queen, sometimes a beast-headed guide, sometimes a stern judge. The details change with geography and language, but the impulse is the same. Humanity cannot look into the abyss without giving it a face. The Grim Reaper of later centuries is a fusion of these older visions: the impartiality of Ereshkigal, the guiding hand of Anubis, the kingship of Yama, the duality of Hel, the gentleness of Thanatos, and the savagery of the Keres. All of these traits were inherited, transformed, and simplified into the skeletal harvester. When plague struck, when famine spread, when mortality became unbearable, the medieval imagination gathered up these ancient fragments and clothed them in a black robe, placed a scythe in their hands, and called them death. But even that was not the final form. As the Grim Reaper solidified in Europe, the figure continued to evolve, taking on new symbols, new associations, and new meanings. The hourglass, the dance of death, the role of psychopomp, all of these layers came later. To see them clearly, we must follow the path from the ancient gods into the chaos of the Middle Ages, where plague and war carved the skeletal face we know today. Among all the ancient faces of death, perhaps none stands in sharper contrast to the image of the skeletal reaper than the Greek figure of Thanatos. When we picture death today, it is usually black robes, bones, and the sharp curve of a scythe. But in the world of Homer and Hesiod, death could arrive with wings, silent and merciful, carrying the soul away like a midwife ushering a child into another world. Thanatos was not painted as a monster. He was not even feared in the same way as Hades or the darker spirits of the underworld. He was the personification of a fact, but a fact softened by beauty. He was death, but he was not cruelty. The Greeks had many ways to describe endings. They had gods for violent destruction, spirits for disease, daimones for sudden catastrophe, but Thanatos stood apart because he was the simple embodiment of the moment of death itself, stripped of excess, He was described as the twin brother of Hypnos, the god of sleep, and together they revealed something that still resonates. The line between falling asleep and dying has always been thin in the human imagination. Both are a surrender, a slipping away into silence. To the Greeks, death was sleep's brother, sometimes indistinguishable, except that one could be woken from and the other not. In Homer's Iliad, Thanatos is mentioned directly when Sarpedon, the son of Zeus, falls in battle. As his body lies on the field, the father of gods commands Hypnos and Thanatos to carry him away from the blood and deliver him for proper rites. The scene is striking because death is not shown as an enemy here. It is not a violent spirit dragging the fallen into oblivion. Instead, death is a companion, almost gentle, almost familial, performing the sacred duty of escorting the body from chaos into honor. The warrior dies, but his death is not abandoned. Thanatos ensures that he is given back to his people. That memory and respect accompany the silence of the grave. This reveals how the Greeks thought about death not only as an end, but as a transition that required dignity. Thanatos was not always depicted with kindness. Tragedians could invoke his inevitability with dread, but the baseline image was not of a predator. He was winged, youthful, sometimes carrying a torch turned downward, a symbol of life extinguished. His siblings reinforced this atmosphere: Hypnos for sleep, Morpheus for dreams, Nyx for night. In that family, Thanatos was simply another part of the cycle, another movement in the eternal rhythm of rest and return. And yet, if you look closer at Greek thought, there is a complexity. Thanatos was gentle in poetry, but in philosophy and in darker myths, he could be relentless. He was unyielding. Even Heracles, the great hero, had to wrestle with him to save Alcestis, the queen who had volunteered to die in her husband's place. In Euripides' tragedy Alcestis, Thanatos is portrayed not as a villain but as an inevitable enforcer. He comes to claim the woman at the appointed hour, robed in black, carrying his blade, certain that no mortal can resist. When Heracles challenges him, the drama turns on the idea that even if a hero can fight death, it is only a temporary victory. Sooner or later, Thanatos returns. The play leaves audiences with the unsettling truth that no one, not even the strongest, can hold him off forever. What is remarkable about this portrayal is how it differs from the Reaper's later costume. Thanatos is not bones, he is not decay, he is a living figure, often imagined as beautiful, youthful, strong. Death in Greek imagination was not always horror, it was also release. Soldiers prayed for a quick Thanatos rather than a lingering disease. Families hoped for his swift wings rather than the long agony of illness. In that sense, Thanatos was not only death, but good death, the kind of end that spared suffering and preserved dignity. The Greeks, like us, were aware of the difference between a merciful departure and a brutal one, and Thanatos embodied the merciful side. His sisters, the Keres, embodied the other, violent, bloody death that fell screaming on the battlefield, tearing at corpses like vultures. In Greek art, Thanatos appears on vase paintings and funerary reliefs, sometimes as a solemn winged youth carrying a body, sometimes holding the extinguished torch. On sarcophagi he is carved not as a monster, but as a dignified presence, almost protective, as if to remind the mourners that death is not always to be feared, but to be respected as part of the order of existence. He was not a deceiver, not a punisher. He was simply the one who came when it was time. This dual nature, the gentle hand and the unyielding certainty, is what makes Thanatos so fascinating as a precursor to the Grim Reaper. The medieval imagination stripped away the gentleness and magnified the terror. The skeletal Reaper carries only the merciless side. But deep in human history, there was this other vision, one where death was not only the Reaper, but also the sleeper, the one who closed eyes with care. Philosophers drew on this. Plato described death as a kind of sleep, a release of the soul from the body's prison. Epicurus famously declared that death should not be feared, because when we are alive it is not present, and when it is present, we are no longer there to feel it. These were intellectual echoes of the same association. Death and sleep are twins, not enemies. The torch of life is lowered, but it is not always accompanied by horror. In this way, Thanatos teaches something that the later Grim Reaper forgot. Death is not only destruction, it is also completion. It can be imagined not as a scythe cutting down, but as a hand closing the eyes of the weary, and this vision persisted. Even in Roman times, the image of Moors was often quiet, and in funerary inscriptions the deceased were said simply to have slept. The Latin word dormitio, falling asleep, became a euphemism for death that carried into Christianity, where the dead were often described as those who sleep in Christ. Thanatos had planted a seed that continued to grow, even as darker images overtook him, and yet Thanatos was never a figure one could avoid. His inevitability gave him a stern side, one that tragedians used to full effect. In Aeschylus and Sophocles, the certainty of death loomed over every choice, every act of hubris. Thanatos could be merciful, but he was not negotiable. His wings were silent, but they were always on their way. For the Greeks, who celebrated the fleeting beauty of life in art, athletics, and poetry, Thanatos was the necessary counterpoint. Life was precious precisely because it was brief. The looming presence of death gave shape to joy. Without him, there was no urgency, no meaning. When medieval Europeans later painted the skeletal reaper, they lost much of this balance. The figure became pure terror, stripped of its gentleness, a monster waiting at the edge of the village with a curved blade. But the older memory of Thanatos never vanished entirely. You can still feel it in phrases like eternal rest or a peaceful passing. You can still see it in art where death is imagined as sleep. And in psychology, the connection remains vivid. Freud himself, when he spoke of the death drive, named it Thanatos, a reminder that deep in the unconscious, death and rest are never fully separated. The Greeks gave us many myths that shaped the Western imagination, but in Thanatos, they gave us something even more intimate, an image of death that was not solely an enemy. In his gentle hand, we see a truth that balances the reaper's scythe. Death can terrify, but it can also soothe. It is the end of struggle, the closing of the eyes, the brother of sleep. The reaper may swing his blade, but Thanatos shows us the face that came before, the face that whispered instead of shouted, that touched instead of tore. The story continues, however, because Thanatos was only one expression of the idea. The Greeks also gave us Hades, Persephone, the Keres, and the entire shadowed landscape of the underworld. To see how the Grim Reaper truly emerged, we must follow death into those darker corridors, into the realms of rulers and judges who shaped how generations would imagine the end. If Thanatos represented the gentle hand of sleep, then the rulers of the underworld showed death in its full, sovereign form. Where Thanatos came softly with wings, these figures reigned over vast realms of silence and shadow. They were not simply moments of death, they were the landscapes of it, the sovereigns who received and contained the endless procession of souls. In the ancient imagination, the underworld was not just a metaphor, but a place, with gates and guardians, with kings and queens, with boundaries that could sometimes be crossed, but never truly escaped. And at the center of each vision stood a lord or lady whose very existence made death not only inevitable, but ordered. For the Greeks, this figure was Hades. He was not the devil, though later Christian thought would sometimes mistake him for one. He was no fiery tormentor, no sadistic punisher. He was, instead, a somber king, robed in black, seated on a throne in the depths of the earth. The very name Hades meant the unseen one, and his domain bore the same name. To die was to go to Hades, and in that sense, his power was absolute. Every soul, regardless of virtue or crime, was gathered into his kingdom. Greek myth often portrayed him with stern inevitability rather than cruelty. He rarely left his domain, and when he did, it was usually to claim a bride. The most famous story is the abduction of Persephone, daughter of Demeter. Hades rose from the earth in his chariot, seized her, and carried her back into his shadowed halls. Demeter's grief at her daughter's loss withered the crops and froze the ground, and only when a compromise was struck, Persephone, spending part of the year above, part below, was life allowed to bloom again. This myth, like the harvest itself, was cyclical. Life, death, rebirth, and again, death. Hades in this story is not villainous for cruelty's sake. He represents the inevitability of death's claim, the unchanging fact that every spring of life must eventually descend into winter. Artists in Greece depicted Hades not as skeletal, but as regal. A bearded figure holding a scepter or a key, sometimes accompanied by Cerberus, the three-headed hound who guarded his gates. His symbols were those of power and boundary, the key because he held the locks of the underworld, the dog because no one could pass without his leave. To encounter Hades was to face authority, not chaos. The Greeks feared him, but they also respected him. He was not worshipped openly. Few prayed to Hades for blessings, but libations were poured, oaths sworn in his name. He was the silent witness, the inevitable king. The Romans called him Pluto, from the word for wealth, for all the treasures of the earth, gold, silver, gems, were believed to belong to him. This title softened his image, making him not only the lord of the dead, but the possessor of hidden riches. Even here, death was not only loss, it was also possession, the reclaiming of all things by the earth from which they came. In Pluto, we see the beginnings of the idea that death holds not only terror, but hidden value, that what is taken is not simply destroyed, but stored, guarded, perhaps transformed. Travel northward into the sagas of the Norse, and another ruler waits in the cold. Hel, daughter of Loki, reigned over the realm that bore her name. Unlike Hades, she was not regal in appearance, but divided, half of her body a living woman, half a corpse in decay. In some accounts, one side was flesh and the other bone. In others, one side radiant and the other blackened. This stark duality made her the perfect embodiment of death's paradox. She was half familiar, half terrifying, half comforting, half monstrous. The souls who came to her were not the warriors slain in glory, for those went to Valhalla or to Freya's hall. Hel received the common dead, those who died of age, illness, accident, or weakness. In other words, the majority of humanity. For this reason, she was both feared and accepted. Her hall was not paradise, but neither was it endless torment. It was simply the afterlife, cold and inevitable, as indifferent as winter itself. In this she resembled Hades, less a punisher than a sovereign, a ruler whose authority came from the inescapable fact that most people end in her hands. In the Old Norse poems, Hel's realm is described as distant, across the river Gjöll, guarded by a bridge and fearsome hounds. The imagery is strikingly similar to that of Greece and Egypt, a land beyond a boundary, ruled by a figure of stern inevitability. What connects them all is the sense that death is not formless. It has geography, it has rulers, it is a kingdom as structured as any on earth. To cross into it is to enter the authority of a being who commands its gates. Other cultures gave similar roles to their death gods. In Mesopotamia, it was Ereshkigal. In India, Yama. In Egypt, Osiris. Each played the same part, the one who ruled where all souls gathered. But the details mattered. Hades was silent and regal, Hel was divided and uncanny, Osiris was judge and restorer, Yama was ancestor and king. Together they show that across the ancient world, humanity needed to imagine death not only as a moment, but as a sovereign presence. The Grim Reaper would later inherit their authority, but he would strip away their thrones and reduce the image to something starker, a figure with no palace, no court, only a blade and an hourglass. Yet the Reaper carries their legacy. When we picture death with keys, we echo Hades. When we imagine the dead in a cold place, we echo hell. When we speak of death as inevitable wealth, we echo Pluto. When we imagine judgment at the end, we echo Osiris and Yama. The skeletal harvester is not truly new. He is a condensation of centuries of lords and ladies of the underworld, reduced to their most essential truth. He is authority without adornment, inevitability without comfort. But to understand why the Reaper took this stripped-down form, why the gentle hand of Thanatos and the regal thrones of Hades and Hell gave way to a skeletal harvester, we must move forward in time. We must walk into the centuries when death no longer felt like an ordered kingdom, but like an unstoppable storm. It was in plague, famine, and endless war that the Reaper shed the regality of the gods and took on the raw, skeletal face we recognize today. The image of the hooded skeleton carrying a scythe did not descend fully formed from the myths of Greece or the sagas of the North. It emerged in a very particular historical moment when Europe was shaken to its core by calamities so overwhelming that they reshaped how people imagined death itself. The lords of the underworld were distant figures, stern but far away, ruling over unseen realms. Thanatos was a whisper, Hell a ruler of shadows, Osiris a judge behind the veil. But in the 14th century, death did not feel distant. It walked the streets, filled the churches, knocked on the doors of every house. It became impossible not to see it in the open. Out of this terror came the Grim Reaper, the face of death stripped of crowns and thrones, reduced to the raw truth of bone and harvest. The most powerful force in this transformation was the Black Death. When the plague struck Europe in 1347, it spread with a speed and brutality that defied comprehension. Entire villages vanished in days, cities were left littered with bodies. Chroniclers described wagons piled with corpses rumbling through the streets, priests too few to bury the dead, families abandoning one another in fear of contagion. Some estimates suggest that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population perished within a few short years. Death was no longer an abstraction. It was everywhere, sudden, merciless, unavoidable. In this environment, the old gods of the underworld seemed inadequate. Hades might rule the shades, but he was far away, buried under the earth. Hell's cold halls were distant in the north. Thanatos might arrive gently, but the plague did not arrive gently. It came with fevers, swellings, blackened skin, delirium, and agonizing suffocation. Death in the plague years was not a distant king or a gentle-winged youth. It was immediate, skeletal, unstoppable. Art and imagination responded in kind. The skeletal figure began to appear on church walls, in illuminated manuscripts, in woodcuts. The body reduced to bones was no longer just a memento of burial. It was the daily reality of what people saw around them. Skeletons danced in frescoes, carrying off kings and peasants alike. Whole murals were devoted to the danse macabre, the dance of death, in which skeletons led living humans in a procession to the grave, mocking the idea that wealth or power could protect anyone from mortality. The bones were not symbolic, they were literal. The living saw them in the streets every day, in shallow graves and mass pits. Famine amplified the terror. In the early 14th century, even before the plague, the Great Famine of 1315-1317 devastated Europe. Heavy rains and failed harvests led to widespread starvation. Chroniclers recorded parents abandoning children, peasants eating dogs, and whole communities reduced to begging for scraps. Skeletons were not only seen in graves but in the faces of the starving. Flesh melted away, leaving gaunt, skeletal forms still alive, but haunted. In this atmosphere, it was natural that death itself would be imagined as a skeleton, a figure stripped of flesh, lean, relentless, empty of mercy. The scythe became the natural weapon for this skeletal figure. Swords and spears were the tools of kings and knights, but famine and plague did not kill like warriors. They killed in swathes, cutting down masses without distinction. The scythe, used by peasants to harvest crops, provided the perfect metaphor. Death moved across the land like a farmer in the fields, swinging his blade and gathering souls in great numbers. The language of sermons reflected this, describing plague as a harvest of God, a reaping of the wicked and the righteous alike. To see death with a scythe was to see truth. Mortality was a harvest, and humanity was the crop. The cloak added another layer. In art, death was often shown wearing a hooded robe, the same kind worn by monks who tended to the dying. In many plague-ridden cities, it was monks who carried bodies to burial, their dark habits becoming associated with funerals and mortality. The hood also concealed the face, a reminder that death could come without warning, faceless and anonymous, to anyone. Over time, this combination, skeleton, scythe, cloak, formed the most enduring image of death in European culture. Religious belief shaped how this figure was interpreted. In Christian thought, death was not the final power. Beyond it lay judgment, heaven, or hell. But the Reaper became a useful symbol in sermons and morality plays. He was not Satan, he was not God. He was the servant who arrived to collect the soul when its time was up. Preachers pointed to the dance of skeletons as a warning. Remember that you must die, and therefore repent. Artists painted skeletal death, trampling over bishops and kings, as a reminder that worldly rank meant nothing in the grave. In this sense, the Grim Reaper was both a figure of terror and a tool of moral instruction. What distinguished the Reaper from earlier gods of death was his lack of a kingdom. Hades had a throne, Osiris had a court, Hell had her halls. The Grim Reaper had no palace. He had only movement, walking endlessly across fields, towns, and cities. He was not a ruler of the dead, but a gatherer of them. This change reflected the experience of the 14th century. People did not feel death as a distant realm. They felt it as a presence moving constantly through their streets. The Reaper was death set loose in the living world, unmoored from thrones and temples, carrying his scythe through every house. The universality of death in those years also shaped the Reaper's meaning. In times of stability, the gods of death could be imagined as selective. Warriors might go to Valhalla, the wicked to torment, the righteous to reward. But in plague, famine, and war, there was no selection. All were taken, children, priests, queens, beggars, all fell alike. The skeleton carrying a scythe reflected this impartiality. His blade did not discriminate. In the murals of the Danse Macabre, skeletons are seen leading both emperors and peasants in the same chain. Death was the great leveler, and the Reaper was its impartial face. The image spread rapidly. In Germany, woodcuts depicted the skeletal figure with hourglass and scythe. In France, murals showed the dance of death across cathedral walls. In England, sermons warned of death standing at every door. By the 15th century, the figure was recognizable across the continent. It was not only a symbol, but a shared language, an image everyone knew. And yet, even in this terrifying form, the Reaper carried echoes of older ideas. His impartiality recalled Ereshkigal and Hades. His faceless inevitability echoed hell. His harvest imagery carried faint memories of agricultural rituals where crops died so that life could continue. In a strange way, he was a condensation of everything that had come before, but stripped of grandeur and softened myth. What remained was bone, blade, and time. The Reaper was not meant to be comforting. but he was not entirely meaningless terror either. He offered an explanation in chaos. In an age when death felt random, the Reaper made it seem purposeful. The blade swung not in madness, but in harvest. The body collapsed not in chaos, but in order. To see death as a Reaper was to make sense of plague and famine, to find in them not cruelty, but inevitability. It was a thin comfort, but it was one people clung to. From this moment onward, the Grim Reaper never left European imagination. He evolved, absorbed new symbols, took on new roles, but his skeletal frame and curved blade remained fixed. The Middle Ages had given death its most enduring mask, and from there the figure would walk into the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and beyond, appearing in art, music, literature, and eventually film. The Black Death had burned his image into the human mind, and no age since has been able to forget it. But the story does not pause with plague and famine. As the Reaper gained form, he also gained new symbols. The scythe and cloak were only the beginning. Soon an hourglass appeared in his hand, reminding all that time itself was the measure of every life. The next step in his evolution would bind death not only to harvest, but to the relentless passing of time, a symbol as haunting as the blade itself.
The figure of the Grim Reaper, as it emerged from plague-ridden Europe, was not only skeletal and armed with a scythe, it was also shrouded. The cloak is as essential to the image as the bones beneath it. The skeletal body alone could have served as a reminder of mortality, but the addition of the hooded robe created something different, something more unsettling. It transformed the Reaper from a corpse into a presence, from a relic of decay into a walking figure that could move silently through the streets. The cloak gave death mobility, secrecy, and an aura of inevitability that no naked skeleton could carry. To understand why this garment became inseparable from the Reaper, we have to look at the world from which it emerged. In the Middle Ages, cloaks and hoods were common. They were not symbols of villainy, but practical garments against rain, wind, and cold. Yet within monasteries and convents, the dark robe became associated with ritual, solemnity, and burial. Monks in particular, those who belonged to austere orders like the Benedictines or Cistercians, wore habits of black or brown. These same monks were often the ones who tended the sick, dug graves, and carried bodies during plague outbreaks. The image of a hooded figure moving silently through the village with the corpse of a neighbor became etched into memory. The robe was not frightening by itself, but when paired with death it became its uniform. The hood concealed the face. That concealment was crucial.
When you saw a skeletal figure, you saw something already explained, a body that had been stripped down, its humanity erased by time. But when the figure's face was hidden beneath a hood, your imagination filled the void. Was it a man, a spirit, a god? Was it bone, or something worse? The lack of a face created a universal terror, the fear of the unknown. In art, the hood shadowed the skull, leaving only empty sockets glinting faintly from within. In sermons, preachers described death as a stranger whose face could not be seen until he stood at your side. In folklore, the hood became a sign that death might already be among the living, moving invisibly, until the moment he chose to reveal himself. The facelessness of the Reaper is one of its most powerful features. Unlike Hades, who could be painted with eyes and beard, or Hell, whose divided features were her defining trait, the Reaper's face was absence itself. Sometimes artists drew only the blank skull, sometimes not even that, just darkness beneath the hood. This blankness stripped death of personality. It was no longer a god with moods or whims. It was inevitability personified, without expression, without pity, without rage. The empty face told the truth more directly than any mask could. Death is not someone you can reason with. Death is silence. The cloak also had another resonance, one rooted in ritual. At funerals, bodies were wrapped in shrouds. The dead were concealed, veiled, hidden from the living. The cloak of the Reaper echoed this shroud. He was not only the bringer of death, but death itself, wrapped in burial garments, a walking grave in human form. To see him was to see what awaited every corpse: the covering of the body, the concealment from the world of the living, the transition into darkness. In this sense, the robe was not only a disguise but a mirror. It reminded the living of the shroud they too would one day wear. The power of the cloak also lies in its universality. It is not an aristocratic garment. It does not mark wealth or status. Anyone could wear a cloak. Everyone did. By placing it on the figure of death, artists ensured that the Reaper belonged to no single class. He could enter the king's hall or the peasant's hut and look the same in both places. He was clothed not in luxury, but in anonymity. Just as death spared no one, the robe gave him no identity beyond his task. In folklore, the blackness of the cloak deepened the association with night. Death was a presence that arrived in the dark, when lamps guttered and silence pressed in. Black was the color of absence, of the unknown, of the void that followed life. It was also the color worn by mourners. To see a cloaked figure in black was to see a mourner and a corpse tender rolled into one. Death was not only the taker of life, but the eternal witness to grief. His robe was woven from the same darkness that shrouded every wake and burial. The faceless quality of the Reaper also reflects something psychological. Humans fear death in part because it cannot be known. To imagine it as a person with features is to risk softening it. To imagine it could be bargained with or understood. The hood strips away this comfort. Death has no eyes to plead with, no mouth to speak, no ears to hear. The empty face reinforces the ultimate truth. Death is not a dialogue, it is a silence that cannot be broken. And yet, this very facelessness gave the Reaper adaptability. He could appear in any culture, any story, and be recognized immediately. The skeletal frame marked him as death, but the cloak and hood made him timeless. A naked skeleton might remind you of the graveyard down the road. A cloaked skeleton became something else entirely, an archetype, a wandering figure who belonged everywhere and nowhere. His hidden face allowed him to be projected into any tale. He could be the stern messenger of God, the impartial harvester of souls, the enemy to be resisted, or even, in rare cases, a guide who ushered the soul into rest. The lack of a face allowed every storyteller to imagine his own. Medieval art shows this transformation vividly. In earlier centuries, death was sometimes painted as a pale man, gaunt but still fleshly, or as a winged figure like Thanatos. After the Black Death, the hooded skeleton appears with increasing frequency. The frescoes of Lubeck, Basel, and La Chaise-Dieu show lines of living figures led by cloaked skeletons in a dance. In each, the skeletons are not kings or demons. They are hooded, faceless figures, sometimes even indistinguishable from one another. The message is clear: death does not have individuality. It does not care who you are. It comes in the same cloak for everyone. The mask of the Reaper, the hood, and the empty face is also a product of theatre. Morality plays performed in medieval Europe often featured personifications of abstract concepts: greed, lust, justice, and death. To portray death on stage, actors would don skull masks and cloaks, making the figure recognizable even in the flickering light of torches. The robe allowed the actor's humanity to vanish, leaving only the archetype. These performances fixed the image in public imagination. Death is the hooded skeleton, the one who speaks few lines, who interrupts the living with a gesture, who waits silently until all stories end. In time, the faceless Reaper also gained philosophical meaning. Thinkers in the Renaissance and beyond used the image of the hooded skeleton to remind readers that mortality is not personal. Montaigne reflected on death as a natural part of life, unchangeable, unalterable, not a punishment, but a condition. The faceless reaper embodied that. He did not come for you because of who you were. He came because it was time. His blank skull and shadowed hood told the truth. He has no interest in identity, only in inevitability. The cloak and the empty face, then, are not decoration. They are the essence of why the Grim Reaper endures. They capture what is most frightening about death: its silence, its anonymity, its impartiality. They also capture what is most universal. No one knows its face, no one escapes its robe. In the scythe we see the harvest, in the hourglass we see time, but in the cloak and the hood we see ourselves shrouded in darkness, stripped of individuality, equalized in the anonymity of the grave. But this figure was not finished yet. The Reaper's cloak gave him anonymity, his skull gave him inevitability, his scythe gave him purpose. Still another symbol was waiting to be placed in his hand, one that would tie him not only to death itself, but to the very flow of existence. The hourglass would become his next defining tool, binding him forever to the idea of time's passage, the sand that marks each life, falling grain by grain until the last. The scythe in the Reaper's hands is perhaps the most immediately recognizable part of his image, so much so that it often overshadows the rest. Without it, the figure might still be terrifying, but with it, he becomes unmistakable. No one confuses a cloaked skeleton carrying a curved blade with anything but death. What makes the scythe so powerful is not only its appearance, but its history, the long shadow it casts over human survival, labor, and imagination. It is not a weapon of war, but a tool of necessity, and by placing it in the hands of death, medieval artists and storytellers gave mortality itself the role of a farmer reaping his harvest. To the people of the Middle Ages, the image was instantly understood. Most of them lived in villages tied directly to the land, dependent on the cycles of sowing and reaping for their survival. The harvest was not an abstract metaphor, it was life itself. Families lived or starved by it, and the act of harvesting grain, swinging the curved blade through the ripe stalks, was not a delicate one. It was swift, repetitive, merciless. In the golden fields, men and women worked side by side, cutting thousands of stalks in great arcs, gathering them into sheaves and leaving the stubble behind. The field that had been green and full only hours before was left barren and empty. When death came in plague or famine, the sight was the same. Streets once filled with laughter were silent, houses once full of families were empty, whole villages were left desolate. It was as if the human world itself was a field cut down by a great invisible hand. The scythe carried older symbolic meanings as well. In pre-Christian Europe, harvest rituals often acknowledged the death of the grain as a sacrifice that allowed human life to continue. The last sheaf cut from the field was sometimes treated as sacred, buried in the soil, or kept through the winter to ensure fertility in the year to come. Death and harvest were bound together in a cycle. The cutting of one life fed the continuation of another. The Grim Reaper's scythe drew on this ancient rhythm. To see him swinging his blade was to be reminded that human beings, like the grain, were part of a cycle. They grew, ripened, and fell, and in their falling they made way for what came next. The Bible reinforced the image. In Matthew's Gospel, Jesus speaks of the end of the world as a harvest, with angels sent out to reap. In Revelation, the Son of Man is described with a sickle in his hand, cutting the earth at the appointed time. Medieval audiences steeped in these texts would have seen the scythe not only as a farmer's tool, but as a divine instrument of judgment. Death as the reaper was not simply an accident of famine or disease, but part of God's larger plan, the final harvest of souls. The curved blade in the skeletal hand carried the weight of scripture, art, and lived experience all at once. In the popular imagination, the scythe also became a symbol of impartiality. The farmer swinging his blade did not pause to select which stalks would fall and which would stand. All were cut when ripe. So too did the reaper move across villages, towns, and cities, indifferent to wealth or poverty, youth or age. His scythe made no distinctions. Kings and beggars alike were stalks in the same field. This impartiality was both terrifying and strangely comforting. It mocked human pretensions to power, but also affirmed a kind of equality. In the dance of death murals, skeletons carried bishops, nobles, peasants, and children alike, and the scythe in their hands underscored the truth. No one was exempt. The scythe also emphasized the collective nature of mortality. A sword or dagger suggests a duel, a single victim at a time. The scythe suggests something else entirely, mass death, sweeping and inevitable. In the 14th century, this was the experience of plague and famine. Whole families died within days, whole villages emptied in weeks. The scythe captured the sense of mortality, arriving not in isolated tragedies, but in waves, arcs, and sweeps that took multitudes at once. This was why the scythe, and not the sword, became death's tool. It was the weapon of multitudes, the symbol of catastrophe that cut through entire populations in a single season. Artists exploited this imagery. In manuscripts and woodcuts, Death was shown striding across the land with his blade, mowing down the living as if they were stalks of wheat. In some depictions, tiny human figures lay in rows like sheaves on the ground, ready to be bundled and carried away. The metaphor was not subtle, but it was devastating. People who had just witnessed half their neighbors die could hardly miss the point. Death was a farmer, and they were his crop. The curved shape of the scythe itself also carried meaning. Unlike a straight sword, the scythe arcs. It suggests inevitability, a swing that cannot be stopped once begun. In the hands of peasants, that swing was practiced, rhythmic, unstoppable across a field. In the hands of the reaper, it was cosmic. Once his blade began to fall, nothing could halt it. This motion was burned into the memory of villagers who watched reapers at work each harvest. To imagine death in the same gesture was natural and terrifying, but the scythe also implied something beyond terror. Harvest was destructive, yes, but it was also necessary. Without it, there was no bread, no survival through winter, no continuation of life. Death, by taking, also made way. The reaper's scythe, grim as it was, carried a whisper of fertility. The field cleared was also the field ready to be sown again. The body buried nourished the earth. The community thinned by plague made way for survivors, for renewal, for transformation. Medieval people may not have spoken in those terms, but the underlying sense of cycle was inescapable. The scythe took, but in taking it sustained the larger rhythm of existence. Later thinkers and artists would expand on this. Romantic poets saw in the scythe not only terror, but melancholy beauty, a reminder of the fleeting nature of life and the promise of renewal. In folk sayings, death's harvest was sometimes linked to the turning of seasons, to autumn leaves falling, to the grain that must die so that bread may live. Even today, when we speak of the grim harvest of war or a generation cut down, we echo the same metaphor that gave the reaper his tool. It is also worth remembering how familiar the sight of the scythe once was. In our own time, most people never hold one. Machines reap the fields, and the curved blade is an antique, a symbol in art more than a tool in life. But for medieval peasants, the scythe was as ordinary as the plough. They saw it every autumn, swung it every day of the harvest. Its sound, the rustle of stalks, the whistle of the blade, was part of their world. To place it in the hands of death was to merge the most common act of survival with the most universal fact of existence. It was genius in its simplicity, and it made the reaper unforgettable. The scythe also connected death to time. The harvest came once a year in its season. So too did death come in its season, when the body was ripe with years, or when famine and plague struck. The scythe reminded people that just as no stalk of wheat could resist ripening and falling, no human life could resist its season of decline. The harvest was inevitable, and so was death. The fields taught the lesson every year, and the reaper carried it into every village and every home. What makes the scythe endure as a symbol is not only its connection to agriculture or to scripture, but its visual clarity. Even without words, the sight of a cloaked skeleton with a curved blade says everything. It tells you that death comes not once, but always. It tells you that you are part of a larger cycle, a crop waiting for its harvest. It tells you that no one escapes the swing. In a world where death was omnipresent, the scythe crystallized all these truths into one image, one gesture, one tool. And yet, the reaper was never limited to his blade. Alongside the scythe came another symbol, one not of cutting, but of measuring. The hourglass, small and simple, became as central as the scythe itself, reminding humanity that the harvest was not only certain but timed, that every life had its allotted span of sand, falling grain by grain until the final sweep of the blade. If the scythe gave death his harvest, the hourglass gave him his law. One cuts, the other measures. One sweeps away the many in a single motion, the other counts down the fate of each individual grain. Together, they create the full picture of human mortality, not only the inevitability of death, but the relentless ticking away of time that makes death certain. In medieval and Renaissance art, the hourglass almost always appears in the skeletal hand opposite the scythe. If the curved blade shows what will happen, the hourglass shows when. It is a simple tool, but in its simplicity lies its terror. The hourglass as an object was already familiar to Europeans by the 14th century. Long before mechanical clocks spread through towns and monasteries, people marked time with water clocks, sundials, and sand timers. The hourglass was particularly striking because it was so physical. You could see time move. Grain by grain, the sand fell, narrowing at the throat of the glass until nothing remained. Time here was not abstract. It was visible, tactile, irreversible. Once the sand had fallen, it could not be undone. The symmetry of the bulbs reinforced the lesson: one full, one empty, one moment alive, one already gone. Placed in the hands of death, the hourglass turned from a tool of sailors and monks into a symbol of cosmic reality. Every life was an hourglass. Every person carried their own fragile bulb of sand, and when it ran out, the scythe would swing.
No one could see how much sand remained in their glass. That was the cruelty. You could not flip it back, could not slow the fall, could not bargain for more grains. The hourglass embodied the tyranny of time, the merciless forward march that drags all living beings toward their end. Medieval preachers made use of this image constantly. In sermons, the hourglass was pointed to as a reminder that your sand is running even now. On tombstones, sculptors carved the glass beside skulls and bones, a permanent memento mori urging the living to repent before their time was gone. In illuminated manuscripts, death himself holds the glass aloft, showing the last grains sliding down, a sign that the victim's hour has arrived. The effect was not subtle. It did not need to be. Everyone in the 14th and 15th centuries lived close to death already. The hourglass only made visible what everyone felt. Life was precarious, fragile, already slipping away. The hourglass also tied death to the larger order of the cosmos. Unlike the scythe, which symbolized sudden harvest, the glass spoke of measurement, order, inevitability. Death was not chaos. It was a schedule. Each person's hour would come not by chance, but by the structure of time itself. To see the glass was to see destiny in motion. Philosophers and theologians alike leaned on this symbolism. Augustine had written of time as a stream carrying us to eternity.
The hourglass visualized that stream in miniature, a river of sand flowing ceaselessly downward until all was drained. What made the hourglass even more effective as a symbol was its universality. Everyone could understand it. Children could watch sand fall through a glass and grasp what it meant. Farmers who measured hours of labor by such tools, sailors who timed their watches by the sand, monks who prayed in intervals marked by glass, all saw in it the same truth. Life is measured. And because the device was ordinary, its symbolism was inescapable. You could hold one in your hand, turn it over, and watch your mortality drip away. Death's hourglass was not a distant abstraction. It was something you could buy in a marketplace. The terror of the hourglass lay not only in the certainty of the end, but in its silence. Unlike a bell or a clock, the sand made no sound as it fell. It moved invisibly, grain by grain, unnoticed until the bottom was full. This silence became part of the metaphor. You never hear your time running out. You only notice when it is gone. The reaper's hourglass was not a warning bell. It was a mute testimony, a promise that while you went about your life, your time was already draining away. In Renaissance art, allegories of time often merged with images of death. Father Time, an old man with wings, was often painted with an hourglass. Sometimes he appeared side by side with the Grim Reaper, blurring the line between time itself and death. It was an easy connection to make. Time is what kills us, grain by grain, day by day. Death is simply the name we give to the moment when the last grain falls. In this sense, the hourglass revealed the deeper truth behind the reaper. He was not only a harvester of bodies, but the embodiment of time's tyranny. The hourglass also influenced how people thought about the value of life. If every grain mattered, then life was not endless. It was a finite resource, one to be used wisely. Philosophers from Seneca to Montaigne reflected on the brevity of life, urging readers to live fully because time is always slipping away. The image of the glass reinforced this message powerfully. Every idle hour was sand wasted. Every moment of joy or sorrow was a grain already gone. In this way, the reaper's hourglass was not only frightening but also instructive. It was a symbol of urgency, a demand to act before the last grain fell. But the hourglass was not entirely bleak. Its cyclical nature also suggested renewal. You could flip it after all and begin again. For the devout, this mirrored the hope of resurrection, the belief that after death there was new life. After time ran out, there was eternity. Artists sometimes painted the reaper's glass with both bulbs half full, suggesting balance, continuity, and the cycle of seasons. In funerary art, this balance reminded mourners that death was part of a larger rhythm, that the grains did not vanish but only moved from one place to another.
Even so, the darker meaning dominated. In the Danse Macabre murals, death often thrusts the hourglass in front of the living, showing them that their time has ended. In sermons, the glass was used to frighten sinners into repentance. In literature, it became a device for suspense and inevitability. The image of sand running out entered the language of everyday life. To this day, we still speak of time running out, a phrase born from the hourglass and the reaper's tyranny. The hourglass also had a democratizing effect, much like the scythe. Time runs at the same pace for all. Kings and peasants alike watch the same sand fall. The reaper's hourglass did not measure rank, wealth, or virtue. It measured only duration. When the glass was empty, the scythe swung, no matter who held the crown or who carried the plough. The impartiality of death was mirrored in the impartiality of time itself. In modern imagination, the hourglass continues to haunt. In films, in books, in cartoons, death still holds it, tilting it slowly as the hero watches their moments drain away. Digital clocks may have replaced sand in our daily lives,
but the symbolism remains. The hourglass is primal. Its shape, its simplicity, its visible flow, all make it more visceral than the invisible ticking of gears or circuits. When paired with the cloaked skeleton, it completes the figure of the Reaper. He is not only the one who cuts you down, he is the one who has been measuring you all along. The scythe and the hourglass together created a figure that was at once terrifying and inescapably true. In the agricultural world of medieval Europe, everyone understood harvest. In the world of monks, sailors, and households, everyone understood the hourglass. By combining them, artists and storytellers distilled mortality into two images so clear that no explanation was necessary. Death takes you when your time is up. The scythe shows the taking, the hourglass shows the time. No one could mistake the message. But the Reaper was not only a harvester and a keeper of time. In the centuries that followed, he became something more, a dancer, a companion, even a guide. The medieval obsession with death gave rise to new imagery, new performances, new art, where death himself led the living in a grim procession, reminding them not only of mortality, but of the strange intimacy between the living and the dead. The dance of death was about to begin, and the Reaper would take his place as its eternal partner. Once the skeletal Reaper had taken his scythe and hourglass, once plague and famine had burned his image into Europe's imagination, he began to appear in a new form that was both terrifying and strangely theatrical. It was not enough for him to stand in doorways or hover over beds. He began to dance. This was not a celebration, not a joyful waltz, but a procession that mocked the living while reminding them of their inevitable fate. The dance of death, or danse macabre, became one of the most enduring expressions of medieval obsession with mortality, a visual and dramatic reminder that no matter who you were, king, bishop, merchant, peasant, you would one day join the same line, holding hands with skeletons as you shuffled into the grave. The origins of the Dance of Death are rooted in the trauma of the 14th century. The Black Death had destroyed entire populations. Wars like the 100 Years' War dragged on, devouring generations. Famines returned in cycles, thinning out those the plagues had spared. In such a world, death was not a distant event. It was an everyday presence. People needed ways to cope, to give shape to the omnipresent shadow that walked among them. Art provided one such way. Across Europe, frescoes and murals began to appear on the walls of churches and cemeteries, showing long processions of the living accompanied by grinning skeletons. The earliest surviving examples date to the early 15th century, though scholars believe the theme may have been circulating in oral tradition and performance long before it appeared in paint. In Basel, Switzerland, a famous mural showed ranks of the living from pope to emperor to knight to farmer, all led away by skeletal partners. In Lübeck, Germany, another sprawling dance of death covered the walls of a cloister, showing merchants and maidens, judges and children, all clutching the bones of their partners as the line snaked toward the grave. In Paris, the Cemetery of the Innocents became renowned for its danse macabre, painted across cloister walls where mourners and passers-by could not fail to see it. The message was clear: death spares no one. It does not matter if you are wrapped in silk or rags, if you sit on a throne or kneel at a plough. The skeleton comes for all, and all must dance. The macabre humour of the scenes was part of their sting. In some depictions, skeletons cavort and grin, their bony fingers tugging on the reluctant hands of bishops or noblewomen. The grotesque laughter of the dead mocked the solemnity of the living. It was satire as much as sermon, art that reminded the rich and powerful that their wealth and pomp would vanish just as quickly as the poor man's bread. But the Dance of Death was not only painted, it was performed. Travelling plays brought the theme to marketplaces and festivals. Actors dressed as skeletons dragged others into mock processions, singing verses about the fleeting nature of life. These morality plays were both entertainment and instruction, designed to amuse while also terrifying audiences into moral reflection. To watch a skeleton pull a king into the line was to see a truth more powerful than any sermon, that in the end, all were equal. This equality was not a modern invention, but a deep medieval truth. The plague had proved it. Priests died in the same numbers as peasants. Nobles fell in the same carts as beggars. The Dance of Death expressed this equality visually, hammering it into the minds of all who saw it. It was not only art, it was ideology, a reminder that worldly hierarchies ended at the grave. For a deeply stratified society where birth and rank determined almost every aspect of life, this was a radical and sobering thought. The skeleton's mocking grins were not only jokes, but revolutionary symbols. In death, the field was leveled. The Danse Macabre also tied directly to the idea of memento mori. Remember that you must die. This phrase was not meant to depress, but to focus the mind. Life was short, uncertain, constantly threatened by war, plague, or accident. To remember death was to remember to live wisely, to confess sins, to prepare for eternity. The Dance of Death hammered this point home with relentless clarity. You could not escape the images. They were on church walls, in manuscripts, in performances, on tombs. Wherever you turned, skeletons were dancing, reminding you that you too would join them. Artists reveled in the contrast between the living and the dead. In many depictions, the living are richly dressed, their faces proud, their bodies healthy. The skeletons beside them are grotesque, sometimes decayed, sometimes exaggeratedly cheerful. The pairing created a jarring humor that emphasized the gap between appearance and reality. You might think yourself beautiful, but look at your partner. This is your future. You might believe yourself powerful, but your skeletal partner is already tugging you toward the grave. The dance itself symbolized inevitability. Once you joined the line, you could not leave. The music played on, the steps carried forward, and the skeletons did not tire. This mirrored the rhythm of life itself. Every day, every year, people joined the procession of the dead. The line stretched back into the past, filled with ancestors, and forward into the future, waiting for children, yet unborn. To see the mural of the dance was to see yourself already in it, waiting for your turn to be called forward. The Danse Macabre spread rapidly across Europe. Each region adapted it to its own culture, but the themes remained the same. In Spain, Portugal, England, and Poland, versions of the dance appeared in churches and texts. The universality of the theme showed how deeply it resonated. Everyone, regardless of language or kingdom, understood the message. It did not need explanation. The skeletons were clear enough, yet the Dance of Death was not entirely grim. There was a strange liberation in it. If death mocked kings and beggars alike, then earthly hierarchies lost some of their terror. If skeletons could laugh, perhaps the living could too. The macabre humor allowed people to confront their fear without collapsing under it. By dancing with death, even if only in paint or performance, people symbolically accepted what they could not escape. It was both submission and defiance, both fear and familiarity. Death was mocked even as it mocked. In this way, the Dance of Death performed a psychological function. It made death visible, familiar, almost routine. Instead of hiding from mortality, people faced it directly, painted it on their walls, acted it out in their festivals. The skeletal figures became companions, reminders that were both terrifying and strangely intimate. Death was not a stranger, but a partner in life's dance, always near, always waiting, always ready to take your hand. Over time, the Dance of Death influenced literature and music. Poets wrote verses in the voice of death, calling out to the living to join his procession. Composers wrote pieces inspired by the theme, with melodies that mimicked the rattling of bones and the steps of dancers. Even today, the idea survives in culture, From symphonies like Saint-Saëns' Danse Macabre to films and cartoons that show skeletons dancing mockingly at midnight, the medieval murals planted an image so strong it has never truly left us. The Grim Reaper was at the center of this imagery, not only as the harvester, but as the master of ceremonies. He did not simply kill, he orchestrated, he led the dance, he arranged the procession. In this role, he became more than a figure of fear. He became a cultural teacher, reminding humanity of mortality, mocking pretensions, leveling ranks, urging repentance. His skeletal grin was cruel, but it was also instructive. The Dance of Death thus cemented the Reaper's role in the medieval imagination. He was not only a figure who came silently at night, he was a public figure, painted in squares, performed in plays, etched into the collective vision of society. By the 15th century, no one in Europe could fail to recognize him. He was not myth alone, not God alone, but a shared language of mortality. And yet, the Reaper was not finished evolving. The Dance of Death made him a companion, a partner in the procession, but he would soon take on another role, one older than any medieval mural. He would become a psychopomp, the guide of souls, the one who did not merely take life, but escorted it to whatever came next. From the gentle hand of Thanatos to the jackal-headed Anubis, this role had always been part of death's imagery. In the Grim Reaper, it resurfaced once more, binding him not only to endings but to passages. There is a difference between killing and guiding. A predator kills, a murderer kills, a plague kills. But guiding belongs to a different order of being, one that exists not simply to end life, but to lead it somewhere else. Long before the skeletal harvester appeared in European imagination, death had already been imagined as a psychopomp, a conductor of souls. From Anubis with his jackal's head weighing hearts against truth, to Hermes in his winged sandals leading shades down to Hades, to Charon rowing across the Styx, cultures across the world created figures whose purpose was not destruction, but passage. Death was not only an event, but a journey, and every journey requires a guide. When the Grim Reaper emerged from plague and famine, he carried not only the imagery of the scythe and hourglass, but also the older memory of death as a psychopomp. The word itself comes from Greek, meaning soul escort. Psychopomps were liminal beings, standing at the border of life and death, ushering the soul from one realm to the next. They did not judge, they did not condemn, they did not reward, they only accompanied. In Homer, Hermes Psychopompos was given this role, leading the shades of the dead gently to the underworld so that they would not be lost or wandering. Without him, the soul might drift in confusion, trapped between worlds. Anubis served the same purpose in Egypt, guiding the dead through trials and protecting them on the journey. In India, Yama's hounds were said to walk beside the soul, keeping it safe until it reached his hall. These figures remind us that for most of history, death was not thought of as an instant obliteration, but as a movement, a crossing from one condition to another. The Grim Reaper, at first glance, seems far removed from these guides. He is skeletal, hooded, faceless, a harvester who cuts down lives without mercy. And yet, if you look more closely at the way he was described in sermons, plays, and folklore, you see traces of the psychopomp beneath the terror. When he points to the hourglass, he is not simply killing. He is indicating that the appointed time has come, that the journey must now begin. When he swings his scythe, he does not merely destroy, he severs the connection between body and soul so that the latter can be released to move on. When he leads the line of the Dance of Death, he is not merely mocking. He is escorting every member of society into the same procession toward the grave. These are the gestures of a guide as much as they are of a killer. The Reaper, as psychopomp, was especially clear in the imagination of ordinary people who lived close to death. In folklore, he often appears not as a raging destroyer, but as a silent visitor. He arrives at the bed of the dying, waits in the shadows, and then takes the soul by the hand or lifts it gently from the body. Stories told of death knocking softly on the door or standing at the foot of the bed until the last breath, then leading the soul away. These stories echo the gentler side of Thanatos and the guiding hand of Hermes. They show that, terrifying as his appearance was, the Reaper was also a necessary companion, one who knew the way across the border when the living no longer could. In medieval and early modern accounts, ghosts were often described as restless because they had not been properly guided to the afterlife. The Reaper, in this context, ensured that such restlessness did not occur. He was the figure who guaranteed that every soul found its way, whether to heaven, purgatory, or hell. This made him less an enemy and more an agent of order. Without him, the boundary between the living and the dead would blur and chaos would ensue. With him, the passage was controlled, inevitable, unbreakable. The role of the Reaper as psychopomp also aligned with the Christian idea of the good death. Priests urged believers to prepare for death with confession, communion, and prayer. The Grim Reaper, when imagined at the bedside, was not necessarily hostile. He was the reminder to the dying that their time had come, that they must leave this world and entrust themselves to God. In this sense, he was not the judge but the usher, the one who came at the appointed hour to lead the soul to its judgment. His impartiality was part of the function.
He did not care if you were saint or sinner. His task was simply to deliver. The visual art of the period reinforced this. In some paintings, death is shown leading souls away, holding them almost tenderly in skeletal hands. In certain woodcuts, tiny human figures emerge from the mouths or chests of the dying, and death receives them like a midwife, carrying them into the beyond. These depictions soften the terror of the Reaper, showing him less as a butcher than as a threshold keeper. He is terrifying to see, but he knows the path, and that knowledge is his true gift. What is striking is how this role persists into modern depictions of death. In films, literature, and folklore, death often appears as a guide rather than an executioner. In Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal, death plays chess with a knight, not simply to kill him, but to accompany him on his journey. In Terry Pratchett's Discworld novels, death is portrayed as a skeletal figure who speaks in capital letters, but his job is to usher souls onward, to explain gently, to ensure no one walks alone. Even in children's stories and cartoons, death is often less a murderer than an escort, appearing at the end of life to lead characters onward. This continuity shows that the psychopomp function is deeply embedded in how we imagine mortality. Psychologically, the Reaper as psychopomp fulfills an essential human need. Death is frightening because it is unknown. The idea of having a guide through that unknown lessens the terror. We fear being lost, abandoned, adrift. To imagine death himself as a guide transforms him from an enemy into something closer to a ferryman. His appearance may still be dreadful, but his purpose is not cruelty. His purpose is passage. This is why the figure endures. Even when depicted as a grinning skeleton, there remains a trace of the older tradition, the guide, the escort, the one who knows the road. There is also a paradox in this role that makes the Reaper compelling. He is both destroyer and helper. He takes away, but he also delivers. He ends, but he also begins. In Jungian psychology, such figures embody what is called the archetype of the shadow, the part of human consciousness that contains both fear and necessity, both danger and wisdom. Death is our shadow, and the Reaper is its personification. By making him a psychopomp, cultures acknowledge that what we fear most is also what we most need, a way to pass from one world to the next. The Reaper's psychopomp nature also explains why he is often portrayed as calm. Unlike demons or monsters, he does not rage or scream. He does not tear or devour. He arrives silently, steadily, with patience. He has all the time in the world, because time itself belongs to him. This calmness is unsettling, but it is also part of his guidance. He does not need to hurry.
He only needs to wait until the sand runs out, and then take the hand of the soul and lead it forward. In this way, the Grim Reaper carries within himself the memory of every psychopomp who came before. Hermes with his winged sandals, Anubis with his jackal's snout, Charon with his oar, Yama with his throne. He is their descendant, stripped of animal heads or divine thrones, reduced to bone and cloak, but still doing their work. The Reaper is not only the harvester of wheat and souls, but the guide across the boundary, the one who ensures no one walks alone into the dark. From this role, new questions arise. If the Reaper guides souls, where does he take them? The answer depends on culture, religion, and belief. For medieval Christians, it was heaven, hell, or purgatory. For others, it was simply the underworld. But always there is a destination. The Reaper is not the destination himself. He is the passage. And this is what makes him different from other monsters and spirits. He does not trap souls. He delivers them. He is frightening, yes, but also indispensable. Without him, death would be chaos. With him, death has order. And so, the Grim Reaper is more than a skeleton with a scythe. He is the last companion, the final guide, the psychopomp who has been walking beside humanity for millennia. In every culture, in every age, the dead have needed a hand to lead them on. The Reaper is our culture's way of acknowledging that need.
He may grin with an empty skull, but in his silence, there is also a strange kind of mercy. The story does not end there, because the Reaper is not confined to his role as guide. Over centuries, he seeped into art, music, and literature, shaping imaginations far beyond church walls and funeral sermons. The skeletal figure that once led souls in frescoes began to dance across canvases, poems, and symphonies, becoming not just a psychopomp, but a cultural icon whose shadow still falls over us today.
Once the Grim Reaper had settled into the European imagination as the skeletal harvester, cloaked and faceless, scythe and hourglass in hand, he did not remain confined to frescoes and sermons. He slipped into the broader currents of art, music, and literature, becoming one of the most versatile figures in Western culture. No single image of him was ever final. Artists painted him as terrifying, satirical, even strangely sympathetic. Composers set his dance into music. Writers gave him voice, philosophy, even humor. His persistence in culture reveals something deeper than mere superstition. He became a mirror for human anxieties, fears, and reflections on mortality, changing shape with every generation that looked into him. In visual art, the Reaper's presence grew steadily from the 15th century onward. After the devastation of plague years, murals of the Dance of Death spread through churches and cemeteries. These paintings were not private meditations, but public spectacles, intended for the eyes of every parishioner who entered. In Basel, a mural stretched across the cemetery wall, showing death-leading figures from every rank of society in procession. The skeletal figures tugged bishops by the sleeve, whispered into the ears of queens, pulled merchants by the wrist. The art combined satire with terror. On one hand, it mocked the pride of the living. On the other, it reminded them that their hour would come soon enough. In Lübeck, the cloister mural of the Dance of Death became famous for its detail, each figure paired with a skeletal partner, each relationship personalized. Here, the Reaper was not a single figure but a multitude, many skeletons each acting as psychopomp for their human partner. This multiplication of death suggested ubiquity. He was not one being moving slowly across Europe, but everywhere at once, in every household, ready for every soul. Art made visible what plague and famine had already taught. Death walks with everyone, whether you see him or not. As the Renaissance blossomed, artists brought new styles and philosophies to the image of the Reaper. Hans Holbein the Younger created one of the most influential series, his woodcuts of the Dance of Death in the 1520s. Each scene paired death with a different social type: the Pope, the Emperor, the Knight, the Peasant, the Child. The skeletal figure was playful, cruel, mischievous, sometimes almost gleeful in his interruptions. Holbein's death was not solemn but mocking, tearing bishops from their pulpits, plucking strings of lutes, snatching children from their mothers. These images were widely copied and circulated, cementing the Reaper as not only terrifying, but satirical. His role was not simply to kill, but to remind humanity of its own foolishness. Baroque artists pushed the imagery even further, emphasizing theatricality. In 17th century Vanitas paintings, the Reaper himself does not always appear, but his symbols dominate: skulls, hourglasses, extinguished candles, wilting flowers, and bones. These paintings reminded viewers that worldly wealth and beauty were fleeting, that behind every banquet and every jewel stood the silent figure of death. When the Reaper did appear directly, he often loomed in dramatic chiaroscuro, lit against dark backdrops, his skeletal form turned into high drama. He was no longer simply a medieval moralizer. He became an emblem of cosmic theatre, the inevitable conclusion of every human story staged with grandeur. In literature, the Reaper proved equally adaptable. Medieval morality plays had already given him dialogue, often casting him as the blunt truth-teller who interrupts human vanity. In Everyman, one of the most famous morality plays of the late 15th century, Death appears as a messenger from God, demanding that every man account for his life. He's not cruel, but firm, insistent, unavoidable. The play's power lies in its universality. Every member of the audience saw themselves in every man, and the skeletal messenger was the figure waiting for them all. Later, literature gave Death more complexity. In romantic poetry, he became a figure of melancholy, less terrifying than sorrowful. Poets like Thomas Gray and Percy Shelley wrote of graves and decay not only as horrors, but as reminders of transience and beauty. In such works, the Reaper's scythe hovers quietly, more mournful than menacing. The romantic imagination often softened him into a symbol of longing, the inevitable end that gave meaning to fleeting joy. In the 19th century, Death took on new guises in Gothic literature. Writers like Edgar Allan Poe conjured him as a haunting presence, lurking in crypts and graveyards, stalking masked balls, whispering behind locked doors. In The Masque of the Red Death, the figure appears as a silent guest at a decadent masquerade, robed and skeletal, bringing plague with him. Here, the Reaper's medieval imagery is repurposed for horror, embodying not only inevitability, but contagion, a terror that moves invisibly among revelers until it strikes. Poe's vision echoes the medieval Reaper born of plague, but in his hands it becomes psychological dread, a story of denial and inevitability crashing together in Gothic splendor. Music, too, absorbed the figure of the Reaper. The late Middle Ages had already seen performances of the Dance of Death, with songs and chants accompanying skeletons on stage. But it was in the Romantic and modern eras that composers fully embraced his imagery. Camille Saint-Saëns' Danse Macabre is perhaps the most famous, composed in 1874. In it, the violin imitates the sound of bones rattling, the xylophone clatters like skeletons dancing in the night, and the orchestra swirls into a grotesque waltz of the dead. The piece captures the mixture of horror and playfulness that had always defined the Dance of Death. Listeners could feel terror and amusement at once, hearing the Reaper's bow strike strings as the world whirled into his midnight dance. Other composers returned to him again and again. Franz Liszt wrote Totentanz, a set of variations on the Gregorian chant Dies Irae, the Day of Wrath, a melody long associated with death and judgment. His piano thundered with the weight of mortality, each note a hammer blow from the Reaper's scythe. Later, in the 20th century, Sergei Rachmaninoff wove the same dies irae theme into his works, echoing the presence of the Reaper in symphonies and concertos. The chant itself, originally part of the Catholic Requiem Mass, became shorthand for the Grim Reaper's presence in music, a motif heard whenever composers wanted to summon death into the room. In folk music and ballads, death was also personified, often as a figure who came knocking at the door or standing at the bedside. These songs, passed orally across generations, show death less as a distant myth and more as a familiar visitor. In English ballads, Death and the Lady tells of a young woman courted by death despite her pleas. In Appalachian folk songs, death knocks at midnight, unyielding but calm. In each, the Reaper is recognizable, patient, impartial, inevitable. The song might differ, but the figure is always the same. By the modern period, the Reaper had become so established that he could be reinterpreted endlessly. He appears in children's books as a curious figure, in novels as a sarcastic wit, in plays as a philosopher. Writers like Terry Pratchett turned him into a character who speaks gently, even humorously, his skeletal form softened by compassion and curiosity. Far from erasing the terror of death, these portrayals play with it, showing how familiar the Reaper has become, how deeply embedded in culture. He is no longer only a figure of horror, but a character audiences can laugh with, even sympathize with, while never forgetting what he ultimately represents. The endurance of the Reaper in art, music, and literature reflects his versatility. He can be terrifying in Holbein's woodcuts, majestic in Baroque paintings, melancholic in romantic poetry, horrifying in Gothic tales, playful in folk songs, and philosophical in modern novels. He shifts with each era, reflecting the mood and anxieties of the time, but his core never changes. He is always the cloaked skeleton, scythe in hand, hourglass close by. Every artist, composer, or writer may dress him differently, but they all know the same truth. He is death, and death does not leave culture alone. From here, the figure would expand beyond art, into the very fabric of thought, becoming not only a symbol in paintings and symphonies, but a subject of psychological interpretation. As the modern age dawned, thinkers began to ask not only how we represent death, but why we must. The Reaper, so persistent in culture, became a clue to deeper truths about the human mind and its relationship to mortality. By the time the Grim Reaper had fully established himself in art, music, and literature, he had become more than a figure of folklore. He had become an archetype, a shape that haunted the imagination across centuries and cultures, emerging wherever human beings wrestled with mortality. With the rise of psychology in the 19th and 20th centuries, thinkers began to examine why such figures exist at all. Why do human beings feel the need to picture death as a person, to put a face and a hand to something that in reality is faceless and impersonal? The answers were not simple. They ranged from Freud's theories of repression and drives to Jung's ideas of archetypes and the shadow. What united them was the recognition that the Reaper is not only a cultural artifact, he is a reflection of the human psyche itself. Freud, always interested in the unspoken drives beneath human behavior, had a complicated relationship with death. Officially, he denied that human beings could conceive of their own death in the same way they conceive of other events. In his essay, Thoughts for the Times on War and Death, written during the First World War, he argued that the unconscious does not believe in death. The ego, rooted in survival instincts, cannot picture its own non-existence. What we imagine when we think of our death is not the annihilation of consciousness, but a kind of observer's fantasy. We picture ourselves watching our own funeral, seeing the world go on without us. For Freud, this impossibility of truly grasping death explains why it so often returns in disguised form, in dreams, in phobias, in symbols. The Grim Reaper, with his scythe and hourglass, is one of those disguises, an image that allows the mind to externalize what it cannot internalize. At the same time, Freud introduced the idea of the death drive, or thanatos, a force within the psyche that pushes towards stasis, silence, and return to an inorganic state. He contrasted this with eros, the life drive, which seeks growth, connection, and reproduction. The two drives intertwine, but thanatos is always present, manifesting in aggression, repetition, and self-destructive tendencies. The name he gave it was no accident. By choosing the Greek god Thanatos, Freud linked his theory to the long tradition of death personified. He may have been speaking in the language of drives and instincts, but he was drawing on the same imagery that had haunted myth and art for millennia. The Grim Reaper, in this sense, can be understood as a projection of the death drive, an externalized figure for the internal pull toward the end. For Freud, then, the Reaper is both alien and intimate. He is the stranger at the door, but he is also a mirror of something inside us, a force we carry within our own psyche. This is why his image unsettles us so deeply. We see not only the inevitability of mortality, but the reflection of our own unconscious drive toward it. The skull beneath the hood is not only the universal symbol of death, it is our own skull, the face beneath our face, the truth we carry but cannot acknowledge without disguise. Carl Jung approached the question from a different angle. Where Freud emphasized repression and instinct, Jung emphasized archetypes and the collective unconscious. For him, figures like the Grim Reaper arise again and again across cultures because they embody fundamental patterns in the human mind. Archetypes are not inventions of individual artists, but shared psychic structures that emerge spontaneously wherever humans reflect on life. Death, being one of the few absolute universals, inevitably generates an archetype. The cloaked skeleton is one of its modern forms, but the same archetype appears as Anubis in Egypt, as Yama in India, as Hell in the north. These are not separate inventions but variations of the same psychic figure, the death bringer, the threshold guardian. Jung also introduced the idea of the shadow, the part of the psyche that contains everything repressed, denied, or unacknowledged. For individuals, the shadow includes the impulses we refuse to see in ourselves. For cultures, it includes the truths societies refuse to confront. Death is the ultimate shadow. It is the truth that life denies, the certainty that culture disguises with rituals, distractions, and stories. The Grim Reaper, in Jungian terms, is the embodiment of that shadow. He is faceless because the shadow is faceless. He is cloaked because we cannot look at him directly. He is skeletal because he strips away all masks, revealing the bone beneath flesh, the reality beneath illusion. What makes the Reaper powerful is precisely this archetypal quality. He does not belong to any one religion or philosophy. He is older than Christianity, older than Greek myth, older than art itself. He is the image the human psyche generates when confronted with mortality. This explains his persistence even in secular culture. Even when people no longer believe in heaven, hell, or underworld, they still picture death as a cloaked skeleton with a scythe. The archetype is deeper than doctrine. It survives belief because it is rooted in imagination itself. Jung also saw in death not only terror, but transformation. For him, archetypes often point towards psychological growth. To confront the shadow is not only to face what we fear, but to integrate it, to accept it as part of ourselves. The Grim Reaper, in this sense, is not only a threat, but an opportunity. He reminds us of what we try to ignore, that life is finite, that denial leads to despair, that acceptance can bring peace. In dreams and visions, encountering a skeletal figure often marks not literal death but symbolic death, the end of one stage of life and the beginning of another. The Reaper thus becomes a teacher, not of destruction, but of renewal. He is terrifying because transformation always is, but necessary because without it, the psyche stagnates. Modern psychology built on these foundations, exploring death anxiety and its effects on human behavior. Ernest Becker, in his influential book The Denial of Death, argued that the awareness of mortality shapes every human action. Culture itself, he suggested, is a vast defense mechanism against death, offering symbols, rituals, and stories that give meaning to existence and soften the terror of the end. The Grim Reaper fits perfectly into this theory. He is one of the most enduring cultural defenses, a way to personify and thus manage the unmanageable. By giving death a face, even a terrifying one, we make it possible to talk about it, laugh at it, argue with it. Without him, death is faceless void. With him, death becomes a figure, and figures can be understood, confronted, even depicted in art and story. From this psychological perspective, the Reaper's many forms in culture make sense. Sometimes he is cruel, sometimes gentle, sometimes humorous, sometimes sad. These are not contradictions but variations of the psyche's relationship with mortality. When people fear death, the Reaper appears as a monster. When they accept it, he appears as a guide. When they laugh at it, he appears as satire. When they meditate on it, he appears as melancholy. The core is always the same, the shadow of mortality, but the expression shifts with the needs of the psyche.
Even today, in a world saturated with technology and science, the Reaper endures because he speaks to something psychology confirms, that humans cannot live without symbolic forms for death. We may explain disease in biological terms, we may measure time with atomic clocks, but we still picture death with cloak and scythe. We cannot imagine him otherwise. Freud would say this is because our unconscious cannot picture non-existence, so we invent a figure to carry it. Jung would say it is because the archetype of death is embedded in the collective unconscious. Becker would say it is because we cannot face death without symbols to soften its blow. Whatever the explanation, the result is the same. The Reaper remains. And yet, psychology also shows us why he sometimes frightens us more than death itself. To look at the Grim Reaper is to look into the shadow, to see what we deny, to face what we repress. He forces us to acknowledge the skeleton beneath our skin, the hourglass hidden in our heartbeat. He is terrifying not because he is alien, but because he is intimate. He is the face of what we cannot escape, our own finitude. From here, the story of the Reaper does not end. The psychological interpretations deepen our understanding, but they do not exhaust it. For death has never worn only one face. In many cultures, death is feminine as often as masculine, a goddess as often as a god. The skeletal Reaper may dominate European imagination, but he has sisters, dark queens, mothers of fate, holy saints of death, who show the same truth in other guises. To fully unmask death's oldest face, we must turn to them as well, to the Morrigan, to Hell, to La Santa Muerte, to the long line of feminine figures who have carried death's power through history. If the Grim Reaper has become the most familiar face of death in the Western imagination, it is worth remembering that he has not always been imagined as male. In many cultures, death was given to a goddess, a queen, or a mother figure who carried both terror and protection. The feminine faces of death reveal something older and deeper than the cloaked skeleton. They show that mortality has never been understood only as harvest and shadow, but also as the domain of women, as destroyer, as guide, as nurturer of endings. To see death as female is not to soften her, but to remember that life and death are part of the same cycle, and women, as bearers of life, were also imagined as bearers of its opposite. One of the most ancient and striking of these figures is the Morrigan, the Irish goddess of battle, fate, and death. She did not arrive with a scythe or an hourglass, but with ravens and blood.
The Morrigan appeared on battlefields, washing the armor of warriors who were about to die, or circling overhead as a crow, her cry foretelling doom. She was one of the triple goddesses of Irish mythology, sometimes appearing as three sisters, Badb, Macha, and Nemain, who together embodied chaos, violence, and prophecy. When the Morrigan appeared to a warrior, it was a sign his fate was sealed. She was not merciful, but she was not random. She chose, she prophesied, she declared who would fall and who would rise. Death here was feminine because it was intertwined with fate, with the weaving of destiny, with the unbreakable cycle that lay beyond human choice. The Morrigan's presence on battlefields reflected a truth that warriors understood. Death was not just an enemy's sword, but something larger, a force moving invisibly through the clash of steel. To imagine that force as a woman shrieking from above gave it form and voice. The ravens that followed battlefields, feeding on the dead, were her messengers and symbols. In this way, the Morrigan embodied both the horror of death and its inevitability. She was terrifying, but also strangely honest. She told you when your time had come. She did not pretend otherwise. The Norse Hel carries another version of the feminine face of death. Daughter of Loki, half beautiful maiden and half decayed corpse, she ruled over the dead who did not die in battle. Unlike Odin's Valhalla or Freyja's Hall, her realm was not a place of glory. It was the destination of the majority, the ordinary dead who perished from illness, age, or misfortune. Her dual form, half alive, half rotting, captured perfectly the liminal nature of death. She was both one of us and utterly other, both familiar and horrifying. Hel's realm was cold and distant, but not necessarily cruel. It was not hellfire, but stillness, not torment, but inevitability. Her presence reflected the Norse acceptance of death as something woven into the fabric of existence. Her feminine form was not gentle, it was divided, uncanny, unresolvable, and yet in her, the truth of mortality was displayed without disguise. She was what we all are, part flesh, part bone, part life, part decay. The feminine death figure did not vanish in later centuries. In Mexico, she re-emerged with extraordinary force as La Santa Muerte, the Holy Death, a folk saint venerated by millions. She is often depicted as a skeleton in a woman's gown, veiled like the Virgin Mary, carrying a scythe in her hands. She looks, in many ways, like the Grim Reaper dressed as a bride. For her devotees, she is not merely terrifying but protective, a patron who grants favors, answers prayers, and shields the faithful. She is feared by the Catholic Church, which refuses to recognize her, but loved by those who feel abandoned by other saints. In neighborhoods marked by poverty, violence, and crime, La Santa Muerte is seen as the one who does not discriminate. She accepts everyone, saint and sinner alike, rich and poor, righteous and wicked. Death spares none, and so she turns that impartiality into a promise of devotion. Her cult reveals something profound about the feminine face of death. Where the male reaper often appears as distant, impartial, and faceless, La Santa Muerte is intimate, personal, and approachable. Devotees adorn her statues with flowers, robes, and offerings. They pray to her for love, money, protection, or safe passage. She does not judge, she simply answers. Death, in her form, becomes not only inevitable, but relatable, a daily companion to whom one can speak. Her femininity softens the terror but does not erase it. The scythe remains in her hands, the skeleton remains beneath the gown, but she smiles, she listens, she embraces. For many, this is closer to the truth. Death is not only the end, but also the companion that walks with us always. The connection between femininity and death is not arbitrary. In many mythologies, women were imagined as guardians of thresholds, birth, fate, and death. Just as midwives ushered new life into the world, goddesses of death ushered souls out of it. The same hands that cut the umbilical cord cut the thread of life. The fates of Greek mythology, the Moirai, were women. Clotho spun the thread of life, Lachesis measured it, Atropos cut it. Their power was absolute. Even Zeus could not resist them. The Grim Reaper with his scythe is a later echo of Atropos with her shears, cutting life when its measure was done. That role, in its earliest form, was distinctly feminine. Psychologically, this feminine face of death reflects the ambivalence humans feel toward mortality. Death is not only destruction, it is also transition. It ends, but also completes. To imagine death as a mother or goddess is to acknowledge that ambivalence. The Morrigan terrifies, but she also reveals destiny. Hell horrifies, but she also rules with inevitability. La Santa Muerte frightens, but she also protects. These dualities are harder to capture in the faceless male reaper. They require the feminine form with its association to birth, nurture, and the cycles of life. In modern culture, the feminine death figure continues to resurface. Films and novels often reimagine death as a woman, sometimes alluring, sometimes terrifying. In art, skeleton brides and veiled female figures recur as symbols of mortality. In psychology, death is often linked to the maternal archetype, the idea of returning to the womb of the earth, of being embraced by the Dark Mother at the end of life. Burial itself reflects this, the body placed back into the ground, into the soil, into Mother Earth. To imagine death as female is to recognize this return, the closing of the circle that began in birth. The persistence of these feminine figures shows that death is not confined to one mask. The Grim Reaper may dominate European imagination, but beside him stand countless sisters, the Morrigan shrieking with ravens, Hell, half corpse, half maiden, La Santa Muerte, skeleton saint in a bridal gown, Atropos cutting the thread with cold precision. Each reveals another facet of the truth, another way of making sense of the inevitable. Together they remind us that death is not a single face, but a chorus, not a single presence, but a multitude. And from here the story continues, because death's presence in modern times is not diminished but intensified. War, industrial slaughter, global catastrophes, and popular culture have all reshaped the Reaper, male and female alike, into figures that haunt not only churches and myths, but films, novels, posters, and even jokes. The Grim Reaper walked out of medieval murals and into the modern world, where his scythe still gleams and his sisters still cry from the shadows. The Grim Reaper did not vanish with the fading of medieval frescoes or the decline of plague. If anything, the modern world gave him more work than ever before. The 20th century was marked by wars, genocides, pandemics, and industrialized killing on a scale no previous age had witnessed. If the medieval imagination gave him his cloak and scythe, the modern world gave him trenches, gas masks, mushroom clouds, and barbed wire. He was everywhere, sometimes depicted directly, sometimes hidden in satire or propaganda, sometimes stripped of his solemnity and turned into a pop culture character. What defines the Reaper in modernity is his flexibility. He can appear as the terrifying shadow looming over a battlefield, or as a comic figure in a cartoon strip. He has not lost his scythe, but he has learned how to wield 1,000 new symbols, depending on the age and audience. The First World War offered him fertile ground. The imagery of death in the trenches was overwhelming. Fields filled with corpses, gas drifting over no man's land, entire regiments annihilated in a single day. Artists and poets turned again to the figure of death to express what they saw. In German and British propaganda posters, the Reaper appeared as the enemy, stalking across maps of Europe with his scythe raised. In trench art and soldiers' songs, he appeared as a mocking companion, the one who sat in dugouts and waited for the shell to land. War poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon did not always name him, but the skeletal presence hangs over their verses, the faceless inevitability that mocks glory and strips war of its illusions. The Second World War expanded his shadow, with mechanized slaughter, aerial bombing, and concentration camps. The Reaper no longer needed to be imagined. He was everywhere, in plain sight. Political cartoons showed him perched on bombers, striding behind tanks, standing with dictators. In Allied propaganda, he was linked to Hitler and fascism, portrayed as the grim companion of tyranny. In Nazi imagery, he appeared too, twisted into racialized propaganda that weaponized death itself against those deemed unworthy of life. The mushroom cloud of Hiroshima became his new silhouette, the scythe replaced with atomic fire. Here the Reaper was not allegory. He was literal, incarnated in technologies that could wipe out entire cities in seconds. Even beyond war, the 20th century gave him presence in disease and famine. The Spanish flu of 1918 was accompanied by illustrations of death-walking city streets carrying away the fallen. Later pandemics repeated the imagery. Posters, editorial cartoons, and photographs used the skeletal figure to symbolize contagion. He was a natural metaphor for invisible killers, a way of giving face to what could not be seen, but was everywhere felt. In times of famine in Africa and Asia, Western media sometimes crudely used skeletal Reaper imagery alongside photographs of emaciated children, blending allegory and reality in disturbing ways. At the same time, the Reaper became a subject of irony. In the 20th century's explosion of mass media, he began to appear in cartoons, comics, and advertisements. His scythe and cloak made him instantly recognizable, and his meaning was so universal that artists could play with him endlessly. In newspaper strips, Death appeared knocking on doors, surprised to find no one home, or sitting on couches waiting politely. In animated shorts, he was clumsy, comedic, or outwitted by clever protagonists. This humor did not erase his terror, it coexisted with it. The Reaper could be laughed at precisely because everyone already knew his seriousness. Humor became another way of coping, just as the medieval dance of death had mixed satire with horror. In literature and film, the Reaper took on new philosophical roles. Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal, released in 1957, gave one of the most iconic modern images, a knight playing chess with death on a desolate beach. Cloaked and pale-faced, the figure embodies inevitability but also dignity. He is not cruel, he is simply present, calm, patient, playing out the game that no one can win. The film struck audiences because it gave death dialogue, personality, and presence without reducing him to parody. It showed him as companion as much as adversary, a reminder that mortality is not something that can be conquered, but something that must be faced with honesty. As the century went on, death became more and more a character. In fantasy novels, he walked and talked. In Terry Pratchett's Discworld series, he is one of the most beloved characters, a skeletal figure who speaks in capital letters, rides a white horse, and struggles to understand human quirks. Pratchett's death is compassionate, curious, sometimes bewildered by the living, but always faithful to his duty. He is still the Reaper, but he is softened, turned into someone readers can love. This transformation is telling. It shows how deeply embedded the figure is in imagination. He is so universal, so instantly understood, that he can be reimagined endlessly without losing his identity. Popular culture has expanded this flexibility. In films and television, death has been played as terrifying villain, romantic figure, even misunderstood friend. In Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, he is a comedic partner. In Supernatural, he is calm, powerful, and strangely respectful. In The Book Thief, Markus Zusak casts death as the narrator, weary from his work during the Holocaust, burdened by the endless procession of souls. Each version reflects a different cultural mood, but all draw on the same core imagery: the cloak, the inevitability, the presence at the boundary of life. In music, the Reaper has kept his hold as well. Blue Oyster Cult's 1976 song, Don't Fear the Reaper, turned him into a metaphor for love that endures beyond death. Heavy metal bands from Metallica to Slayer have invoked him in album art and lyrics, often as the embodiment of darkness, rebellion, or existential dread. Classical music continues to echo him through the Dies Irae motif, used in films like The Shining and countless symphonies to summon the presence of death. Even in genres far from gothic or metal, the Reaper lingers as a metaphor, his universality making him useful wherever mortality needs a voice. What stands out in the modern world is how the Reaper has moved from sacred to secular, from church walls to cinema screens, from sermons to memes. He can appear in a political cartoon about healthcare policy, then in a horror film, then in a humorous internet post where he knocks on doors labeled with celebrities' names. The speed with which people recognize him shows how deeply his archetype is lodged in culture. No explanation is necessary. A black cloak, a skeletal hand, and a scythe are enough to summon the entire history of mortality. And yet, for all the humor and satire, the Reaper's presence remains serious when it needs to be. Memorials to war dead often feature skeletal or cloaked figures. Anti-smoking campaigns, anti-drunk driving posters, and public health warnings have all used the Reaper as their symbol. Even governments reach for him when they need to remind people of mortality. He may appear in cartoons one day and in propaganda the next, but his power never disappears. He is always available, always recognizable, always waiting. In this sense, the modern Reaper is not so different from his medieval ancestor. He still mocks the powerful, still equalizes the field, still walks beside us in times of catastrophe. But he has also become familiar, almost domesticated. People make plush toys of him, print him on t-shirts, laugh at his jokes in comic strips. This is not disrespect. It is recognition. The humor is another way of acknowledging mortality, of living with it without collapsing under its weight. The Reaper is so inevitable that he can even be laughed at because everyone knows the joke will end the same way. From war to pop culture, the Grim Reaper has proved himself one of the most enduring figures in human imagination. He is terrifying and funny, solemn and satirical, cruel and compassionate. He wears many masks, but all of them reveal the same truth. Death is always with us. In the modern world, surrounded by technology, science, and entertainment, he has not faded. If anything, he is more visible than ever, flickering on screens, painted on album covers, etched into protest signs and memorials. He walks through our wars and through our jokes, through our tragedies, and through our laughter. He is still the same figure born of plague and famine, still cloaked and faceless, still holding the scythe and the hourglass, but now he stands also in film reels, on billboards, and in the endless scroll of digital feeds. And from here, the questions deepen. If he has been with us so long, and if we continue to invite him into our art and imagination, then perhaps we need him more than we fear him. Perhaps the Reaper, whether in a mural or a meme, is less an enemy than a necessity, a reminder, a companion, a teacher. To understand why we fear him and why we cannot let him go, we must look not only at history and culture, but at ourselves, at the strange human need to give mortality a face and a name. For centuries, the Grim Reaper has loomed over imagination as one of the most recognizable figures in human culture. We know why he frightens us: the skeletal grin, the black cloak, the silence of his approach, the inevitability of his scythe. But the deeper question is why he persists. Why do people return to him again and again, in paintings, in literature, in music, in jokes, in nightmares? If the fear of death were the only thing that mattered, we might expect cultures to suppress his image, to avoid it, to pretend it does not exist. Instead, they keep drawing him, naming him, inviting him onto stages and into stories. The truth is that we fear the Reaper precisely because he is necessary. He embodies mortality in a way that allows us to live with it, to speak of it, to manage the unmanageable. Without him, death is faceless chaos. With him, death has a mask, and masks can be faced. Part of the fear comes from what the Reaper represents at the most primal level. He is the skeleton beneath the skin, the reminder that our bodies are temporary and fragile. Every time his hood slips back to reveal the empty sockets and grinning teeth, we are forced to see the truth of our own anatomy. Beneath every face, no matter how beautiful, lies the same skull. Beneath every body, no matter how strong, lies the same fragile frame of bone. This is the oldest horror. The body that carries us is also the body that will decay. The Reaper frightens because he strips away illusion, showing us what we already carry inside. His scythe amplifies that terror. It is not a tool of personal violence, not a dagger aimed at an individual, but a blade designed to cut masses at once. To see the Reaper with his scythe is to confront not only our own death, but the death of communities, generations, civilizations. The swing of his blade reminds us that we are stalks in a field, that no matter how unique we feel, we are part of a harvest. The fear here is not only of personal extinction, but of being swept away anonymously, indistinguishable from the thousands who fall beside us. The hourglass deepens the unease. Time is not something we control, and the sand is always falling. We live with clocks and calendars, but those are human inventions. The hourglass in death's hand reminds us of the greater truth, that each moment is already running out, that life is a finite measure being poured away grain by grain. What frightens us is not only the end itself, but the knowledge that it is already underway, that every breath and heartbeat is another grain gone. To live is to approach the empty bulb, and the Reaper's glass makes that fact visible. Beyond his symbols, we fear the Reaper because he embodies what philosophers call the unknown. Death is not only the end of bodily life, but the end of consciousness as we know it. No one can return to describe what lies beyond. The Reaper stands at that boundary, cloaked and faceless, because what waits beyond the hood is unimaginable. We can imagine skeletons and scythes, but we cannot imagine non-existence. He terrifies because he reminds us that we are walking towards something that no one understands. His blank face is our blank knowledge. And yet, for all these reasons to fear him, cultures keep painting him, telling stories about him, and even laughing with him. This persistence reveals his other side. The Reaper is frightening, yes, but he is also useful. He gives death a shape that can be engaged. The faceless void becomes a figure with a hood. The silence becomes a skeletal grin. The chaos becomes a scythe and an hourglass. These symbols do not erase mortality, but they make it bearable. They allow human beings to create rituals, tell stories, and even play games with death. Without such images, death is overwhelming. With them, it is something the imagination can hold. This is why the Reaper often appears not only as enemy, but as guide. People need a figure to accompany them into the unknown, to show that the passage has structure. Thanatos did this in Greece, Anubis in Egypt, Hermes Psychopompos with his winged sandals. The Grim Reaper continues the tradition. His cloak may be dark, but it is still a cloak that embraces. His scythe may cut, but it also frees the soul from the body. His presence at the bedside in folklore and story is not only menace but reassurance. Someone is there to guide, not just to destroy. In psychological terms, this duality is essential. Ernest Becker argued that human culture is built on the denial of death, that we construct religions, nations, and achievements as defenses against mortality. But even denial requires an object to push against. The Reaper provides that object. He embodies what we fear so that we can ritualize it, resist it, negotiate with it. Jung would call him the shadow, the truth we cannot escape but must eventually integrate. To deny the Reaper is to repress what will inevitably return. To acknowledge him, even in humor or satire, is to begin to integrate mortality into consciousness. This explains why the Reaper thrives in both horror and comedy. In horror, he terrifies us into remembering what we deny. In comedy, he becomes a character we can laugh at, a way of shrinking fear into manageable size. Cartoons that show him losing his scythe or being outwitted by mortals are not insults. They are cultural therapy, ways of practicing confrontation with death in a safe and playful form. The very fact that people can laugh at the Reaper shows how necessary he is. Without him, death would be too terrifying to joke about at all. On a deeper level, we need the Reaper because he equalizes. In societies built on inequality, where wealth and power seem to divide people into different worlds, the Reaper reminds us that all are the same at the end. Kings and beggars, generals and peasants, celebrities and unknowns, all fall into the same line, all take the same dance, all lie beneath the same earth. This leveling is frightening because it mocks our ambitions, but it is also liberating. Death is the one truth that makes us equal. The Reaper embodies that equality with his facelessness. He does not care who you are. He does not need to. His scythe swings the same for everyone. There is also a paradox in his role. By personifying death, he both terrifies us with inevitability and comforts us with predictability. If death were purely random, purely chaotic, it would be unbearable. To imagine the Reaper as a figure with purpose, with a scythe, with an hourglass, is to impose a kind of order on the chaos. His presence says, this is not meaningless. It has a rhythm, a cycle, a law. You may not like it, but at least it follows rules. In this sense, the Reaper is a form of reassurance disguised as horror. The Reaper also teaches, though not always gently. His presence in art and literature is a reminder to live with urgency. The hourglass in his hand is not only a threat, but a lesson. Time is short. Use it well. The scythe is not only destruction, but reminder. Life is a harvest, and you are part of it, so make your season count. The cloak is not only concealment, but warning. Everything you think defines you will one day be stripped away, so find meaning in what cannot be taken. These lessons are harsh, but they are necessary. Without them, people fall into denial, forgetting mortality, until it crashes down unprepared. With the Reaper's image before them, they are forced to remember. In this way, the Grim Reaper is paradoxically a guardian of life. By confronting us with death, he intensifies our sense of living. Medieval people painted him on church walls not only to terrify, but to remind themselves to repent, to savor, to prepare. Modern people draw him in cartoons or write him into novels, not only to mock, but to explore what it means to live meaningfully in the shadow of death. He is feared because he ends, but he is needed because he clarifies. His skeletal grin says what philosophers and poets have always said: life is brief, precious, and impossible to take for granted. This is why the Reaper endures across centuries. He is not a passing superstition or a relic of medieval imagination. He is an archetype, a mirror, a mask humanity has always needed. We fear him because he is the face of the unknown, but we need him because he makes the unknown visible. Without him, death is silence and void. With him, death is at least a figure we can face, argue with, laugh at, or respect. He is both enemy and teacher, both terror and companion. And so he continues to walk with us through plague and war, through symphonies and cartoons, through nightmares and jokes. He is the shadow at the edge of every path, the skeleton beneath every skin, the timekeeper behind every clock. We fear him because he takes everything away, but we need him because he gives everything meaning. And as history shows, no matter how the world changes, no matter what new technologies arise, the Reaper never leaves. He simply adapts, always cloaked, always faceless, always carrying the scythe and the glass, always reminding us of what we would rather forget, always showing us why remembering is the only way to truly live. From the first images of skeletal figures painted on church walls to the cloaked harvester walking through modern cartoons and films, the Grim Reaper has always seemed like an enemy. He frightens, he mocks, he takes. His scythe swings without mercy, his hourglass empties without pause, his hood conceals a face we cannot see. He is easy to imagine as villain, the antagonist who comes for us all. And yet, when you look closer, across myth, history, psychology and art, another truth emerges. Death has rarely been imagined as evil. Death is feared, yes, but more often than not, it is also respected, accepted, even honored. The oldest faces of death across cultures were not villains, but gatekeepers, guardians of thresholds, necessary beings who stand at the boundary between life and whatever comes after. The Grim Reaper, for all his skeletal grin, belongs to this lineage. He is not demon, not tyrant, not cruel king. He is the keeper of the gate. To see this clearly, you have to strip away the layers of modern misunderstanding that have sometimes painted death as sinister in the sense of evil. In Christianity, Satan became associated with hellfire and punishment, and in popular thought, death was sometimes lumped into the same category, as though to die were to be seized by the devil. But this was never the full picture. In scripture and in tradition, death itself was never the enemy. Death was the passage. The enemy, if there was one, was sin, or separation from God. Death was simply the unavoidable threshold. The Reaper, then, is not the devil's servant, but something else entirely. He is closer to the angel who announces that the time has come, the one who accompanies the soul to its judgment. His role is not to condemn, but to deliver. Older traditions make this even clearer. Hades, for all his somber authority, was not evil. He was stern, but he was just. Hell, with her half-rotten face, was not malicious but inevitable. Anubis, weighing the heart, was not punisher but judge. Yama, in Hindu and Buddhist tradition, sits as king of the dead, but he is revered, not hated. The Morrigan shrieked on battlefields, but she was prophecy, not cruelty. These figures are frightening because they remind us of mortality, but they are not villains. They are custodians of the transition, necessary beings who ensure that death has order, that the dead do not wander aimlessly, that the living know their limits. The Grim Reaper inherits this role, even if his skeletal form makes him appear harsher. He is terrifying, but he is impartial. He is faceless, but he is fair. He does not torture, he does not deceive, he does not gloat. He comes at the appointed time, and when he comes, he takes the soul to where it must go. The fear comes from inevitability, not from cruelty. The Reaper is not hated because he is malicious, but because he is inescapable. And yet, precisely because he is inescapable, he becomes necessary. Without him, death would be chaos. Souls would wander, life would have no boundary, time would have no shape. He is frightening because he enforces the limit, but he is also what makes the limit meaningful. Psychology helps explain this paradox. Jung's idea of the shadow teaches that what we fear most is often what we most need to acknowledge. The Reaper embodies the shadow of mortality. To confront him is to confront our own finite nature, and yet, in confronting him, we gain clarity. We see life's brevity, its urgency, its value. Without the Reaper, we would be tempted to believe we are endless, to waste time, to live without awareness. His presence forces us to live differently. In this sense, he is teacher as much as threat. He is the stern figure who keeps us honest, reminding us that every grain of sand counts. This is why in many cultural stories, the encounter with death is not simply defeat, but transformation.
Folk tales often feature characters bargaining with him, wrestling with him, trying to trick him. Sometimes they succeed temporarily, sometimes they fail. But in every case, the encounter forces the character and the audience to reflect on life itself. The Reaper is not only there to take, he is there to make people confront meaning. His role as gatekeeper is not only of the afterlife, but of wisdom. He stands at the edge of life, forcing us to ask what we did with the time allotted.
Even in modern popular culture, where he is often softened or parodied, the Reaper's role as gatekeeper remains intact. In Bergman's The Seventh Seal, the knight's chess game with death is not about winning, it is about facing. Death allows the knight to play, to reflect, to confront his doubts. In Pratchett's novels, death is not villain, but companion, a cosmic worker doing his job with surprising compassion. In folk devotions to La Santa Muerte, death is not enemy, but saint, protector, and provider. All of these are variations of the same truth, that death is not an evil force, but the keeper of the passage, the one who enforces the most ancient law, that everything that begins must end. We need to see the Reaper in this light because villainizing him distorts the truth. If death were evil, then life itself would be meaningless, always ending in defeat. But if death is gatekeeper, then life gains context. Its brevity is not cruelty, but boundary, a shape that gives meaning to days and years. Without death, there is no urgency, no value, no cycle. Without the gatekeeper, there is no gate. The Reaper frightens because he stands at that gate with keys and scythe. But he is not the enemy for standing there. He is the reason the gate is real. This understanding reaches back to the oldest religious and cultural visions. In the cycle of crops, death is what allows new growth. In the myth of Persephone, the descent into Hades is what makes spring possible. In the wheel of karma, death is what allows rebirth. In Christianity, death is what leads to resurrection. The Grim Reaper, stripped of mythic thrones and crowns, condensed into cloak and bone, still carries this oldest truth. His harvest makes way for new fields. His hourglass does not only end, it measures. His facelessness is not cruelty, but universality. He is frightening because he is impartial, but he is needed because impartiality is what makes the cycle fair. To call him a villain is to misunderstand his role. Villains can be defeated, overthrown, resisted. The Reaper cannot. He is not a rival in a story, but the condition of the story itself. He is the punctuation mark at the end of every sentence, the curtain at the end of every play. You do not fight the curtain. You perform knowing it will fall. This is the difference between hating him and recognizing him. Fear remains, but acceptance transforms it into clarity. The oldest cultures understood this. The gods and goddesses of death were not loved, but they were honored. Offerings were made, prayers whispered, oaths sworn. The Grim Reaper deserves the same recognition, not as demon, but as archetype, the figure who embodies the truth we cannot escape, but also cannot live without. Seen this way, the Reaper is not only the oldest face of death, but one of humanity's oldest companions. He walked with the first farmers who cut their fields, with the first mourners who buried their dead, with the first storytellers who tried to make sense of endings. He has changed shape, jackal, crow, queen, skeleton, but the function has always been the same. He keeps the threshold, he enforces the passage, he reminds the living of their limits and escorts the dead to what lies beyond. This is why he is still here, in murals, in novels, in memes, in the quiet moments at hospital bedsides. He is not going anywhere because he does not need to. As long as humans live and die, they will imagine him, paint him, laugh at him, curse him, thank him. He is feared because his work is final, but he is needed because without him, life would have no shape, no urgency, no meaning. He is the oldest face of death, and he is not a villain. He is the gatekeeper who waits for us all, the shadow that walks beside us, the reminder that to live fully is to live with him always at the edge of the path.